Listen closely to the words spoken nearly 2,500 years ago. You will go, you will return, never in war will you perish. A king was given this prophecy, a promise of safe return from battle, and he trusted it completely. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, he did return only to be murdered the very same day. This is the power and the peril of prophecy, a force that has captivated humanity since the dawn of civilization. It is the haunting whisper from the Oracle of Delphi, the cryptic warning etched into crumbling tablets, the vision that changes the course of an empire. We are drawn to these predictions because they speak to our deepest desires and our most primal fears, the longing to know what lies ahead, to see the invisible threads that connect our past to our future. Time and again, throughout the sprawling tapestry of human history, certain predictions have defied all logic and explanation. They are not just lucky guesses or vague horoscopes. They are startlingly specific, detailing the rise and fall of kings, the outcomes of great battles, and the fates of entire civilizations, often centuries before the events themselves unfolded. How is it possible that an ancient seer could describe the death of a monarch with pinpoint accuracy, or foretell the discovery of a new world across a vast ocean? Were these individuals gifted with a divine sight, a connection to a realm beyond our own, or are we, in our search for meaning, simply connecting random dots to create a pattern that was never really there? This is the great mystery we are about to explore together. In this video, we embark on a journey through the annals of time to uncover 25 of the most astonishing ancient prophecies that came true. We will stand beside Roman emperors who were warned of their doom, decipher codes left by medieval mystics, and unravel predictions that seem to have anticipated everything from technological marvels to world-altering conflicts. This is not merely a list of strange coincidences. It is an investigation into the very nature of time, fate, and foresight. So I invite you to open your mind to the impossible, to suspend your disbelief, and to join me as we delve into these tales of destiny. The question we will confront again and again is a simple one. Are these prophecies nothing more than incredible strokes of luck, or do they point to something far more profound, something woven into the very fabric of our reality? The answers we find may just change the way you see history forever. Our journey into the realm of fulfilled prophecy begins in the 6th century before the Common Era, with one of the most famous consultations in all of ancient history. We travel to the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in what is now Western Turkey, ruled by a monarch whose name would become synonymous with immense riches, King Croesus. His kingdom was a beacon of power and prosperity, a crossroads of trade where gold flowed as freely as the rivers. But a new threat was rising in the east, the expanding Persian Empire under the formidable Cyrus the Great. Faced with a momentous decision to either attack this growing power or wait to be attacked, Croesus sought divine guidance. And there was only one place to go for such a crucial answer, the Oracle at Delphi. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus in Greece, Delphi was considered the very center of the world. Kings, commoners, and conquerors alike would make the arduous journey to this sacred site, bringing lavish gifts in hopes of receiving a prophecy from the Pythia, the priestess who served as the mouthpiece of the god Apollo. It was believed that her words, though often cryptic, held the absolute truth of what was to come. Croesus, wanting to ensure he was consulting the most powerful oracle, first tested several others. He sent emissaries to different oracles, instructing them to ask on the 100th day after their departure what the king of Lydia was doing at that very moment. The response from the Pythia at Delphi was stunningly accurate. She described him in a way that was both bizarre and precise. He was cooking a lamb and tortoise stew in a bronze pot. The report of this uncanny detail convinced Croesus of her authenticity, and he showered the temple with an unimaginable fortune in gold and silver, enough to make even the wealthiest kings blush. Now confident in the oracle's power, he asked his all-important question: should he wage war against the Persian Empire? The response from the Pythia has echoed down through the millennia, a masterpiece of divine ambiguity. She declared, "If you cross the river Hollies, a great empire will fall." To Croesus, this was the clear, unambiguous assurance of victory he had been praying for. He heard only what he wanted to hear. The empire that would fall could only be the empire of his enemy, Cyrus. Emboldened by this perceived promise from the gods themselves, he mobilized his formidable army and crossed the Hollies River, the natural boundary between his kingdom and Persia, initiating a war he was certain he would win. The initial battles were inconclusive, and Croesus, perhaps feeling a twinge of doubt, retreated to his capital, Sardis, to regroup for a larger campaign the following year. But Cyrus was a military genius who would not wait. In a bold and unexpected move, he pursued Croesus to his very doorstep, leading his army right up to the seemingly impregnable walls of Sardis. The subsequent battle was a disaster for the Lydians. Their famed cavalry, a force to be reckoned with on open plains, was rendered useless by a clever Persian tactic. Cyrus ordered his camels to be placed at the front of his lines. The unfamiliar sight and smell of these animals spooked the Lydian horses, causing chaos and breaking their charge. The Persian army swept into the city, and the mighty kingdom of Lydia was conquered in a single, decisive stroke. As the dust settled and Croesus found himself a prisoner of the man he had sought to destroy, the chilling truth of the oracle's prophecy became horrifyingly clear. A great empire had indeed fallen, but it was not the Persian Empire, it was his own. The prophecy was technically perfect, yet fatally misleading. Croesus had been defeated not by the swords of the Persians alone, but by the ambiguity of a divine message and his own fatal assumption. This story serves as a powerful introduction to the nature of ancient prophecy. It reminds us that these predictions were rarely simple fortune cookies. They were complex puzzles that required interpretation, and the cost of a misinterpretation could be a kingdom. The tale of Croesus and the Oracle of Delphi stands as an eternal warning about the dangers of hearing only what we wish to hear, and a stunning example of a prophecy that came true in the most devastating way imaginable for the one who sought it. But if the story of King Croesus demonstrates the peril of misinterpreting a prophecy, our next tale reveals how a correct interpretation could literally save a civilization from total destruction. We now turn our attention from the sun-baked hills of Greece to the rising power of the Italian peninsula, the Roman Republic. In the early 4th century before the Common Era, Rome was not yet the unstoppable juggernaut it would become. It was a burgeoning city-state, vulnerable and still defining its place in the world. Its greatest trial arrived in the form of a terrifying and unexpected enemy, the Gauls, a massive army of these fierce Celtic warriors, led by a chieftain named Brennus, descended from the north, sweeping aside Roman resistance with brutal efficiency. The confrontation came at the River Allia in the year 390 before the Common Era, and it was an unmitigated catastrophe for the Romans. Their army was routed, leaving the road to Rome itself completely undefended. Panic seized the city. Most of the population fled in a desperate exodus. A small, valiant garrison of soldiers, along with a group of the most revered priests and Vestal virgins who carried the city's sacred religious objects, fortified themselves on the Capitoline Hill, the city's spiritual and defensive heart. The rest of Rome was abandoned to the invaders. The Gauls entered the city, finding it largely empty, and proceeded to loot and burn it. Then they laid siege to the Capitoline Hill, confident that starvation would soon force the last defenders to surrender. It was in this moment of existential crisis, with the very idea of Rome on the brink of being extinguished, that the Roman Senate turned to its most sacred and secret source of divine guidance, the Sibylline Books. These were not ordinary texts. They were a collection of prophetic utterances, originally purchased from a mysterious, ancient prophetess known as the Sibyl of Cumae. The story goes that she offered 9 books of prophecies to the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, at an exorbitant price. He refused. The Sibyl burned 3 of the books and offered the remaining 6 at the original price. Tarquin refused again. She burned 3 more and offered the final 3, still at the same price. This time, bewildered, Tarquin consulted his priests, who chastised him for not buying all 9. He finally paid the full, original sum for the 3 surviving books. These became the Sibylline Books, and they were treated with the utmost reverence. They were kept in a stone chest beneath the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, and they could only be consulted by a special committee of 2 high-ranking priests, the Duumviri Sacris Faciundis, and only by direct order of the Senate in times of extreme peril. As the Gauls tightened their siege, the Senate gave that order. The priests unsealed the sacred texts and searched for a prophecy relevant to their desperate situation. What they found was both specific and strange. The books foretold that the Gauls could be driven out, but it also contained a cryptic warning about the need for extreme vigilance on the Capitoline Hill itself. The Romans interpreted this as a divine instruction to guard their last stronghold with unwavering attention. This vigilance is what led to one of the most famous incidents in Roman history. The Gauls, growing impatient, attempted a night assault. They found a steep, unguarded path up the cliff face of the hill and began to climb in silence, hoping to catch the defenders by surprise. The Romans and even their dogs remained unaware, but the sacred geese of the temple of Juno, which had been spared from slaughter despite the famine because they were dedicated to the goddess, heard the subtle noises of the climbing warriors. They erupted into a furious cackling and flapping of wings. The noise alerted a former Roman consul, Marcus Manlius, who was sleeping nearby. He rushed to the spot, saw a Gallic warrior already cresting the summit, and with a mighty shove of his shield, sent the man tumbling down onto the climbers below. His shouts rallied the other defenders, who rained down javelins and stones, breaking the attack and saving the garrison. This event, known as the Geese Saving the Capital, was seen as the direct fulfillment of the Sibylline prophecy. The vigilance it demanded had been rewarded, but the books promised more than just defense. They pointed toward a savior. That savior was the exiled general Marcus Furius Camillus. While the siege continued, Camillus, who had been living in a nearby town, was appointed dictator by the remnants of the Roman government. He raised an army and marched to relieve the capital. According to the legend, he arrived just as the starving Romans were negotiating a surrender, and in a dramatic moment attacked the Gauls, defeating them and liberating the city. The significance of this prophecy cannot be overstated. The consultation of the Sibylline Books provided not just a practical strategy, but something far more crucial in a moment of total despair, hope and divine sanction. It gave the besieged Romans a reason to hold on, a belief that their gods had not abandoned them. The secrecy surrounding the books, managed by their elite keepers, added to their aura of immense power and authority. For centuries afterward, the Sibylline Books would be consulted for guidance on everything from religious rituals to dealing with plagues and military threats, their prophecies shaping the destiny of the Roman state. This event cemented their role as the ultimate spiritual guide of the Republic, a tangible link to the divine that had, according to legend, saved Rome from annihilation and set it on its path to becoming an empire. From the legendary books that saved Rome, we move to a prophecy of a far more personal and poignant nature, one that foretold not the salvation of an empire, but the tragic end of a dynasty and a young man who was the living embodiment of 2 great worlds colliding. Our story takes us to the dramatic climax of the Roman Republic's civil wars, to the sun-drenched city of Alexandria, Egypt. Here, Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty, ruled alongside her young son, Ptolemy Caesar, known more commonly by the affectionate nickname Caesarion, Little Caesar. His very existence was a political statement. He was the biological son of Gaius Julius Caesar, and in him, Cleopatra saw the future, a Greco-Egyptian empire stretching across the Mediterranean, led by the heir to both Caesar's legacy and the ancient pharaohs. But this dream had a formidable enemy, Gaius Octavius, whom history would come to know as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. As the adopted son and official heir of Julius Caesar, Octavian viewed Caesarion not as a cousin or a political rival, but as a direct and existential threat to his own claim to power. A son of Caesar's own blood posed a challenge that no adopted son could ever fully eclipse. The final war of the Roman Republic was, in many ways, a personal feud between these two heirs, fought between the naval forces of Octavian and his right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa, and the combined fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, a stunning victory for Octavian that sent Antony and Cleopatra fleeing back to Egypt, their cause all but lost. It is in the tense, fearful atmosphere of Alexandria in the months following Actium that our prophecy emerges. Ancient historians, including Cassius Dio, recorded a strange and unsettling omen. A statue of Caesarion, likely a bronze or marble likeness erected to celebrate his status as a king and heir, began to behave in an impossible way. It was said to have wept. Not just a trickle of moisture from condensation, but genuine, flowing tears. In the ancient world, statues were not mere decorations, they were vessels of spiritual presence. A weeping statue was universally interpreted as a sign of profound grief and impending doom, a direct message from the gods that the person represented was marked for a terrible fate. The message could not have been clearer to the people of Alexandria. Their young king was destined for death, and the prophecy was brutally fulfilled. After Octavian's forces invaded Egypt and both Antony and Cleopatra had taken their own lives, the 16 or 17-year-old Caesarion was left utterly alone. Trusting the advice of his tutor, he attempted to flee to a port on the Red Sea, perhaps hoping to find refuge in India or Arabia, but he was intercepted by Roman soldiers. Octavian faced a moment of cold political calculation. He was advised by a philosopher, we told, that too many Caesars is not a good thing. The logic was ruthless. As long as Caesarion lived, he would be a figurehead for rebellion, a living reminder of a different line of succession. Octavian gave the order, and the son of Julius Caesar was executed. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, was extinguished, and Egypt was annexed as a personal province of Rome. The question, of course, is whether this eerie prophecy was a genuine supernatural event or a later invention. Skeptics argue persuasively that tales of weeping statues are common tropes in ancient histories, often added by writers to dramatize a tragic narrative and provide a sense of poetic justice or divine foreshadowing. It is entirely possible that later Roman historians, writing with the benefit of hindsight, inserted the story to underscore the inevitability of Caesarion's fate and to legitimize Octavian's harsh decision as part of a preordained destiny. Yet the power of the story lies not necessarily in its literal truth, but in what it reveals about the ancient mindset. For the people of Alexandria, living through the terrifying final days of their kingdom, the rumor of a weeping statue would have been a devastating confirmation of their worst fears. It was a folk legend born from collective anxiety, a supernatural explanation for a political murder that was too cruel and too significant to be accepted as mere chance. The prophecy of the weeping statue, whether fact or literary device, remains a haunting epitaph for a boy who was born to unite two worlds, but who became the ultimate casualty of Rome's ruthless ascent to empire. Now we shift our focus from the fate of individuals to the destiny of an entire faith, a prophecy that offered a framework for survival during some of the darkest periods in religious history. Imagine being part of a small, often secretive community in the vast Roman Empire, living in constant fear of arrest, torture, or being torn apart by wild animals for your beliefs. In such a climate of terror, a powerful idea began to circulate among early Christian communities, a prophecy that provided not just comfort, but a strategic roadmap for endurance. This was the prophecy of the 10 great persecutions, while later attributed to theologians like Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century. The belief itself took root earlier, offering a startlingly specific prediction. The Church would face 10 major empire-wide waves of persecution, and after the 10th, a Roman emperor would finally embrace Christianity, bringing the torment to an end. This prophecy gave a divine meaning to the immense suffering Christians were experiencing. Instead of being random, senseless acts of violence, each new persecution was seen as a predetermined step in a sacred countdown. It transformed their ordeal from a hopeless struggle into a trial with a guaranteed, glorious conclusion. The first of these 10 persecutions was widely identified as the one unleashed by the infamous Emperor Nero in the year 64, following the Great Fire of Rome. Needing a scapegoat, Nero targeted the Christians, a group already viewed with suspicion. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded the horrific details, describing how Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, crucified, or burned alive to serve as human torches in Nero's gardens. This set a brutal precedent. The list of persecutions continued, each under a different emperor who saw the growing Christian sect as a threat to Roman tradition and imperial authority. Under Emperor Decius in the 250s, a systematic effort was made to force Christians to recant their faith by demanding public sacrifice to the Roman gods. Under Valerian a few years later, high-ranking clergy and wealthy Christians were specifically targeted, with many executed and their property confiscated. These waves of violence were not continuous, but they were severe, creating a rhythm of terror and respite that seemed to fit the prophetic pattern perfectly. But the ultimate test, the persecution that would be remembered as the 10th and final great trial, was the great persecution initiated by Emperor Diocletian, beginning in 303. This was by far the most extensive and brutal of all. Diocletian, aiming to restore unity to a fracturing empire, saw Christianity as a divisive force. His edicts ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of sacred scriptures, and the imprisonment of clergy. Christians were stripped of their legal rights, and those who refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods faced torture and death. It was a full-scale, state-sponsored attempt to eradicate the faith entirely. For Christians who believed in the prophecy of the 10 persecutions, this was the final, desperate storm they had to survive. And survive they did, despite the immense pressure the Church endured. Then, in a turn of events that must have seemed nothing short of miraculous to believers, the prophecy reached its climax. Diocletian's successor, Galerius, who had been a fierce advocate of the persecution, issued an edict of toleration in 311, effectively ending the state-sponsored campaign. But the true fulfillment came just 2 years later. In 313, Emperor Constantine the Great, who had come to power after a series of civil wars, issued the Edict of Milan alongside his co-emperor Licinius. This landmark decree granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, legalizing Christianity and restoring property to Christians. Constantine himself would later convert, becoming the first Christian emperor. For the early church, this was the exact moment the prophecy had foretold. After the 10th and most terrible persecution under Diocletian, a Roman emperor had indeed embraced their faith. The impact of this belief in the 10 persecutions on early Christian identity cannot be overstated. It provided a powerful theodicy, an explanation for why a benevolent God would allow his followers to suffer so terribly. It was not punishment or divine abandonment. It was a preordained purification, a necessary crucible that would ultimately lead to triumph. This narrative fostered incredible resilience, giving martyrs the courage to face death with the conviction that their sacrifice was part of a larger, divine plan that was inevitably moving toward victory. The prophecy of the 10 persecutions became a foundational part of Christian historiography, a story that shaped the faith's understanding of its own past and its place in the world, demonstrating how a prediction could forge an identity strong enough to withstand an empire. But the story of fulfilled prophecy is not confined to the ancient world or the rise of Christianity. Centuries later, as the Roman Empire transformed into the Byzantine Empire in the East, a new and equally powerful prediction took root, one that would haunt the final hours of the greatest city in the world, Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city founded by Constantine the Great stood as an unbreachable bastion of Christendom, its massive triple-layered walls defying countless armies. Yet, a persistent legend whispered that the city's fate was already sealed, tied to the life of an emperor who shared its name. This was the prophecy of the Marble Emperor, a belief that the last emperor, Constantine, would one day be turned to marble and hidden, only to return in the empire's darkest hour to restore its glory. The man who would embody this prophecy was Constantine XI Palaiologos, and his reign began with the weight of this ancient expectation squarely on his shoulders. By the time Constantine ascended the throne in 1449, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. It was no longer a vast empire but a collection of fragmented territories with its capital, Constantinople, isolated and surrounded by the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. The city's population had dwindled, its treasury was empty, and its legendary walls, the mighty Theodosian walls, were in desperate need of repair. Against this backdrop of decay, the prophecy of the Marble Emperor offered a fragile thread of hope. It was said that an angel had saved the last Roman emperor, turning him to stone and concealing him in a cave near the Golden Gate, the city's ceremonial entrance. There he slept, waiting for a divine call to awaken, drive out the enemies of the faith, and reclaim the imperial throne. For the citizens of Constantinople, living under the constant threat of Ottoman invasion, this was more than a folktale. It was an article of faith, a promise that their suffering was temporary and that a miraculous salvation was part of their destiny. A more immediate and terrifying version of this prophecy, however, foretold the city's fall with chilling specificity. It was widely believed that Constantinople would be conquered by a powerful enemy, but only when the moon was in a particular phase, a sign in the heavens that would signal the final act. In the spring of 1453, all the pieces of this prophetic puzzle began to fall into place. The young and ambitious Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, had made no secret of his desire to capture the city, seeing it as the key to establishing a truly world-spanning empire. He assembled a colossal force estimated at over 80,000 soldiers, along with a massive fleet and enormous cannons, one of which, named the Basilica, was so large it could fire a stone ball weighing over 1,200 pounds. For 53 days, the Ottomans bombarded the ancient land walls, while Emperor Constantine, with a defending force of fewer than 10,000, orchestrated a desperate and brilliant defense, patching the breaches as they appeared and repelling wave after wave of attacks. The final assault began in the early hours of Tuesday, May 29th. For hours, the defenders held the line against the elite Janissary corps in a furious, bloody struggle. But then, a small, forgotten postern gate, the Kirke Porta, was left open after a counterattack, allowing a group of Ottoman soldiers to infiltrate and raise their flag on a tower inside the walls. Panic spread among the exhausted defenders. At this precise moment of chaos, observers noted the position of the moon. It was in its waning phase, a thin crescent hanging in the pre-dawn sky, the exact celestial sign that the older prophecies had warned about. For those who believed the city's doom was now cosmically confirmed, Emperor Constantine, realizing the end had come, made a final, symbolic choice. He tore off his imperial regalia so he would not be distinguished from his soldiers, and with a small band of loyal men, he charged into the oncoming horde near the St. Romanus Gate, disappearing into the maelstrom of battle. His body was never identified. this heroic last stand became the final, poignant chapter of the prophecy. In the eyes of his people, Constantine XI did not merely die, he vanished. This disappearance was crucial. It allowed the legend of the Marble Emperor to live on. Instead of a confirmed death, there was a mystery. Many Greeks refused to believe he had been killed, holding on to the hope that he was merely sleeping, hidden away, and would one day return to liberate the city. This belief persisted for centuries, a testament to the power of prophecy to provide comfort in the face of catastrophic loss. The fall of Constantinople was a watershed moment in history, marking the end of the Middle Ages and the final collapse of the Roman Empire. Yet, the event was seen by contemporaries not just as a military defeat, but as the fulfillment of a destiny written long before the first Ottoman canon was ever cast, a dramatic demonstration of how prophecies can shape the narrative of history itself, giving meaning to both triumph and tragedy. Our journey now takes us from the fall of empires to the cryptic verses of a man whose name has become synonymous with prophecy itself, Michel de Nostradame, known to the world as Nostradamus. A 16th century French apothecary and astrologer, Nostradamus composed a collection of prophetic verses called the Prophecies, a book of 942 quatrains, 4-line poems grouped into sections called centuries. Their deliberately obscure and metaphorical language, blending French, Latin, Greek, and Provençal, has made them a Rorschach test for centuries, with readers finding predictions for everything from the rise of Hitler to the September 11th attacks. But perhaps the most famous and enduring link is between one particular quatrain and a catastrophic event that reshaped one of Europe's great cities. Let's examine Century 2, Quatrain 51. The original French reads, Le sang du just à Londres faire fort, / Bruxelles par faudes de vingt trois les six, / la dame antique chera de place haute, / de mesme sec plusieurs seront oxes. A common English translation renders it as, the blood of the just will be lacking in London, / burnt by fireballs of 23 the 6, / the ancient lady will fall from her high place, / many of the same sect will be killed. For those seeking a prophecy of the Great Fire of London, the clues seem tantalizingly clear. London is mentioned by name, a rarity in Nostradamus's work. The phrase "burnt by fireballs" perfectly captures the image of a city consumed by flames, and the numbers 23 the 6 have been endlessly interpreted as a date, the year 1666. The fire began in the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, in a bakery on Pudding Lane, fanned by a strong easterly wind and fueled by the city's tightly packed wooden buildings and warehouses stocked with combustible materials like oil and timber. The fire rapidly grew into an inferno. For 4 days, the flames raged uncontrollably, devouring 13,200 homes, 87 parish churches, and the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, the ancient lady of the quatrain falling from her high place. The description of the city being struck by fireballs could easily be seen as a poetic depiction of the chunks of burning debris that sailed through the air, spreading the fire from one rooftop to the next. The human toll, while remarkably low in terms of verified deaths, was a social catastrophe, leaving 70,000 of the city's 80,000 inhabitants homeless. The phrase, "the blood of the just will be lacking," could be interpreted as a comment on this immense suffering and the loss of life among the city's populace. Yet, this seemingly perfect match is a textbook example of the criticisms leveled against Nostradamian interpretations. The quatrain is a masterpiece of ambiguity. The blood of the just will be lacking could mean a shortage of just people, or it could mean a literal lack of blood, a reference to execution or violence, not necessarily a fire. The numbers 23 the 6 are syntactically bizarre. They could be read as 23 and 6 29, as 23 times 6 138, or as a date 23 of June. The fire was in September, not June. Furthermore, Nostradamus wrote in the 1550s, over 100 years before the fire. While that seems impressive, skeptics argue that the link is a product of retrofitting. The process of interpreting vague phrases after an event has occurred to make them seem specific. Without the knowledge of the Great Fire, would anyone have read this quatrain and predicted a massive urban conflagration in London in 1666? Almost certainly not. The quatrain could just as plausibly be linked to any number of historical events involving fire and a city. This is the central problem with Nostradamus. His verses are so flexible that they can be molded to fit countless scenarios, their meaning imposed upon them by hindsight rather than drawn from clear foresight. The story of this prophecy, then, is not just about a prediction that came true, but about our powerful, enduring desire to find order and meaning in the chaos of history, even if we have to write the meaning ourselves. While Nostradamus offers a puzzle of cryptic words and numbers, our next prophecy presents a vision of startling clarity, one that seems to leap across centuries to describe a defining technology of our modern world. We travel now to the high plateaus of the Himalayas, to the spiritual traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, and to an ancient prediction known as the Prophecy of the Iron Bird. Within the rich tapestry of Buddhist teachings about the cyclical nature of time, particularly the concept of declining ages, there exists a remarkable forecast. It is said that in a future time, a dark age when spiritual values wane, the skies would be filled with iron birds. For a civilization that knew only the flight of eagles and the whisper of prayer flags in the wind, this was an almost unimaginable concept. Yet the prophecy was incredibly specific, not just describing metal aircraft, but also hinting at their purpose, to carry people and weapons across the globe. This was not a vague omen. It was a detailed description of aviation written long before the principles of flight were ever scientifically understood. The arrival of the first airplanes in Tibet during the 20th century was, for many Tibetans, a moment of profound and unsettling significance. When these roaring machines first breached the once impenetrable Himalayan sky, they were not seen merely as marvels of foreign engineering. They were viewed as the literal fulfillment of an ancient spiritual warning. The prophecy of the Iron Bird was intrinsically linked to predictions about a period of great turmoil and the decline of the Buddha's teachings. The sight of these metal birds, therefore, was not a cause for celebration but a sobering signal that a difficult age, known as the Kali Yuga in broader Indian cosmology, had truly begun. This interpretation was tragically reinforced by the events that accompanied the technology. The aircraft that first appeared in any significant number were military, used for reconnaissance and transport during periods of geopolitical tension and eventual conflict in the region. For observers, this mirrored the darker aspects of the prophecy, that these iron birds would be associated with war and the disruption of their traditional way of life. This leads us to a fascinating question about the nature of prophecy itself. How could a medieval Tibetan mystic possibly conceive of an airplane? Skeptics offer a rational explanation. The description is a coincidence, a lucky guess based on a universal human desire to fly, later reinterpreted to fit observed events. This is a compelling argument. The dream of flight is archetypal, found in myths from Icarus to flying carpets. Perhaps the Iron Bird was simply a poetic metaphor for that enduring ambition. Yet another perspective suggests something more intriguing. Could such predictions be less about literal fortune-telling and more about a deep, intuitive understanding of humanity's trajectory? Prophecies like this one often emerge from a state of deep meditation or spiritual insight, a state where the seer might tap into the collective unconscious or perceive the logical endpoint of humanity's technological impulses. From this viewpoint, the prophecy isn't magic, it is a profound extrapolation. A sage observing humanity's growing mastery over materials like metal and our innate drive to conquer natural boundaries like the sky might intuitively foresee a time when the two would combine. The prophecy of the Iron Bird, then, might be a testament not to supernatural vision, but to a profound human insight into our own inventive spirit. This idea connects this Tibetan prediction to a whole category of ancient prophecies that appear to foreshadow technological advancement. From the Vimana flying machines described in ancient Indian epics to Leonardo da Vinci's sketches of helicopters centuries before their time, there is a recurring theme of premonition about technology. What makes the Tibetan example so powerful is its cultural and spiritual context. It isn't just a prediction of a machine, it's a moral commentary on its impact. The prophecy embeds the invention within a framework of spiritual decay, suggesting that the technology itself is neutral, but its arrival signals a shift in the human condition, a move away from spiritual priorities toward material and potentially destructive power. This adds a layer of depth that transcends simple accuracy. It becomes a warning about the double-edged sword of progress, a reminder that every great leap forward can carry unforeseen consequences, a message that resonates deeply in our own age of rapid technological change. While the idea of a world-ending cataclysm captured headlines, the ancient Maya themselves left behind a far more nuanced and profound vision of time's purpose. Their view of the cosmos was not linear, with a clear beginning and a definitive end, but cyclical, composed of vast, repeating ages, each with its own character and spiritual challenges. Central to this intricate cosmology is the prophecy of the 9 hell cycles, a concept embedded within their famous long count calendar. This wasn't a countdown to destruction, but rather a grand evolutionary map of human consciousness itself, a staggering intellectual achievement that has only recently been understood in its full complexity. To grasp this prophecy, we must first step away from our modern conception of a calendar as a simple tool for tracking days. For the Maya, time was a sacred, living entity, and their calendars were elaborate theological documents designed to align human society with the rhythms of the gods and the universe. The long count was the master clock for these great cycles. It measured time in units that are almost unimaginable in scale. A kin was a single day, 20 kin made a yuanal, 18 yuanals formed a ton, or a year of 360 days. 20 tons composed a katan, about 20 years, and 20 katans made a baktan, a period of roughly 394 years. The prophecy of the 9 hell cycles unfolds across a span of 13 baktans, a period of about 5,125 years. This is the cycle that began, according to most scholars, in August of 3114 before the Common Era, and which reached its completion on the now infamous date of December 21, 2012. The term hell cycle can be misleading. It originates from the Aztec concept of the 9 hells, but when applied to the Maya system, it refers less to a place of punishment and more to a series of underworlds or levels of existence. Each of these 9 cycles, which they called underworlds, represents a distinct stage in the evolution of life, matter, and most importantly, consciousness. The first level, for instance, was associated with the beginning of cellular life, while subsequent levels saw the development of animals, human tribes, and early civilizations. With each new underworld, the rate of time, or the pace of change, was believed to accelerate dramatically. Imagine a spiral staircase where each revolution brings you to a higher plane of complexity, but the steps become steeper and you must climb them faster. A cycle that once lasted billions of years at the level of planetary formation might last only a few centuries at the level of modern human society. This acceleration explains the frantic pace of technological and social change we experience today, from the Industrial Revolution to the digital age in a mere blink of cosmic time. The culmination of this entire grand process was the 9th and final underworld, which began in March of 2011 and lasted only 256 days until December 21, 2012. This final cycle was said to represent the peak of the acceleration, a period of intense transformation focused on the highest level, cosmic consciousness. According to the prophecy, this was not a date for the world to end, but a moment for it to be reborn, for humanity to undergo a collective shift in awareness. It was envisioned as a portal, a chance to leave behind old patterns of conflict, materialism, and separation, and step into a new way of being based on unity, compassion, and a direct connection to the cosmos. The end of the long count was therefore a moment of immense potential, a graduation, not an annihilation. So how did this sophisticated philosophical concept become synonymous with a Hollywood-style apocalypse? The misinterpretation began with a collision of Western anxieties and a fragmentary understanding of Maya culture. When early researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries deciphered the calendar's end date, they projected their own cultural fears onto it. The idea of a cycle ending was foreign to a linear worldview that thinks in terms of creation and apocalypse. Furthermore, the Maya themselves did record prophecies and omens, often tied to the completion of a katan, which could include predictions of drought, war, or the fall of rulers. By taking these shorter cycle prophecies out of context and applying them to the grandest cycle of all, a narrative of global doom was easily constructed. Popular media in the late 20th century latched onto this dramatic, simplified version, fueling a global phenomenon of 2012 mania that resulted in countless books, documentaries, and blockbuster films, all while largely ignoring the Maya's own more hopeful and complex message. The true legacy of the Maya prophecy, then, is not a failed prediction of doom, but a powerful invitation to reflect on our place in a vast, rhythmic universe. It offers a framework for understanding the overwhelming speed of modern life not as chaos, but as part of a purposeful, cosmic process. In the years since 2012, many have looked back and wondered if a shift did in fact occur. While no physical cataclysm arrived, one could argue that we have entered an age of unprecedented global connectivity and a growing collective awareness of our planetary challenges, from climate change to social justice, a kind of painful but necessary awakening that aligns with the idea of a consciousness transformation. The Maya elders who maintain the traditions often expressed frustration with the apocalyptic hype, insisting their ancestors were offering a message of hope and responsibility. The end of the calendar was a reminder that we are co-creators of our reality, and that the future is not a fixed destination written in stone, but a potentiality shaped by the choices we make in the accelerating flow of time. From the intricate cosmic cycles of the Maya, we journey to the vast, sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, where a young conqueror sought not just to expand his empire, but to fundamentally reshape his own identity. After securing Egypt with astonishing speed, Alexander the Great felt drawn to a destination far off the beaten path, a place of immense spiritual significance, the remote Siwa oasis. This was no ordinary military detour. Nestled deep in the Libyan desert, Siwa was home to the legendary Oracle of Ammon, a god the Greeks equated with their own king of the gods, Zeus. For a ruler whose ambitions stretched to the very ends of the known world, a blessing from such a powerful deity was not just desirable, it was a political and spiritual necessity. The journey itself was an epic undertaking fraught with peril. Ancient historians like Arrian describe how Alexander's small party became lost in a brutal sandstorm, only to be saved by a miraculous rain, and according to the most dramatic accounts, guided by 2 crows or snakes that led them to the oasis. This perilous pilgrimage was framed as a trial, a test of worthiness imposed by the god himself. Upon his arrival, Alexander was led into the temple to meet the high priest. What happened next would echo through history and become a cornerstone of his legend. As told by sources like Plutarch, when Alexander approached the oracle, the priest, perhaps intentionally mistranslating a traditional Egyptian greeting, addressed him not as a mortal king, but with the staggering words, "O Padian," which can be translated as, "O my son." More significantly, he reportedly hailed Alexander as the son of Zeus Ammon. This was not a simple honorific, it was a divine proclamation. In that moment, the prophecy transformed Alexander from a brilliant Macedonian general into something far grander, a living god, the direct offspring of the supreme deity. This declaration provided the ultimate validation for his unprecedented campaign of conquest. It was no longer just about strategic expansion or personal glory. It was a divine mandate, a sacred duty to bring the known world under the rule of a god-king. The psychological impact on Alexander was profound and unmistakable. He embraced this new identity with fervor, weaving the prophecy into the very fabric of his public image. From that point forward, he began to adopt the symbols of Ammon, notably the ram's horns, which started to appear on his coins and statues. He would often press his finger to his forehead in a thoughtful pose, a subtle reference to his supposed divine horn. This belief in his own divinity began to influence his behavior, fostering a growing autocracy and a distance from the very Macedonian companions who had fought alongside him from the beginning. The prophecy gave him an unshakable confidence, a sense of invincibility that propelled him further east into India, pushing the boundaries of his empire beyond what any of his advisors thought possible. It also created a dangerous tension, as his longtime soldiers and generals grew increasingly uneasy with a leader who demanded to be worshipped as a god, a concept alien to traditional Macedonian culture. But we must confront the critical question that historians have debated for over 2 millennia. Was this a genuine divine revelation or a brilliantly staged piece of political theater? The accounts we rely on, primarily from Greek and Roman writers like Plutarch and Arrian, were written centuries after the fact, often relying on sources favorable to Alexander. Skeptics propose a far more pragmatic explanation. Alexander was a master of propaganda. He understood that to rule the ancient and deeply religious civilization of Egypt, he needed more than military might. He needed religious legitimacy. By orchestrating, or at least heavily influencing, the oracle's pronouncement, he could present himself as the legitimate pharaoh, the beloved son of Ammon, in a way that resonated powerfully with the Egyptian populace. The priest at Siwa, likely aware of the power of the young conqueror who now controlled Egypt, may have been all too willing to provide the endorsement he sought. In this light, the journey to Siwa was not a spiritual quest but a calculated political maneuver, one of the most successful branding campaigns in history. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complex intersection of belief, ambition, and strategy. Alexander was raised on the heroic myths of Achilles and Heracles, figures who straddled the line between human and divine. It is entirely plausible that he genuinely believed in the possibility of his own divine parentage, and the oracle's words confirmed a deep-seated personal conviction. Simultaneously, he was a shrewd enough statesman to recognize the immense political value of such a prophecy. It served to consolidate his power in Egypt, intimidate his enemies, and elevate his status above the petty rivalries of his own court. The prophecy of the oracle at Ammon, therefore, stands as a powerful testament to how an ancient prediction could become a self-fulfilling force. Whether divinely inspired or politically engineered, it fundamentally altered the course of history, fueling the ambitions of a man who would forever change the map of the ancient world and redefine the very concept of kingship. Leaving behind the deserts of Egypt, we now travel across the Atlantic to the heart of another civilization that saw its existence as part of a grand cosmic drama. In the high-altitude basin of what is now Mexico City, the Aztec Empire erected a magnificent capital, Tenochtitlan, a city of canals and towering temples that seemed to touch the sky. But beneath this splendor lay a profound and terrifying anxiety, rooted in a creation myth of cyclical destruction. This was the prophecy of the 5 sons, a narrative that explained not only the origin of the world but also its inevitable cataclysmic end. For the Aztecs, time was not a linear march toward progress. It was a series of ages, each presided over by a different sun, each ending in a specific kind of apocalypse. According to their cosmology, the gods had created and destroyed 4 worlds or suns before the current one. The first sun, presided over by the god Tezcatlipoca, was destroyed by jaguars that devoured the giant beings who lived then. The second sun, ruled by Quetzalcoatl, ended with great hurricanes that transformed humanity into monkeys. The third sun, under the rain god Tlaloc, was consumed by a rain of fire, while the fourth sun, associated with the water goddess Chalchutlicue, was washed away in a great flood. We live now, the Aztecs believed, in the era of the fifth sun, known as Nahui Olan, or Four Movement. This age was born in the ancient city of Teotihuacan when the gods sacrificed themselves to create a new sun. The humble and penitent god Nanahuatzin leaped into a divine bonfire to become the sun, but he refused to move across the sky until the other gods offered their own lives in sacrifice. From its very inception, the fifth sun was drenched in divine blood, establishing a terrifying precedent. The sun required a continuous offering of life force, of sacred energy, to continue its daily journey. Without it, the world would plunge into permanent darkness. This belief was not an abstract theological concept. It was the central driving force of Aztec state, religion, and society. The sun, Tanatea, was not a distant ball of gas but a hungry deity who needed to be fed the most precious substance in the universe, human blood, or Chalchihuatl, meaning precious water. The primary duty of the Aztec state, particularly its warrior class, was to wage flower wars, staged battles against neighboring city-states like Tlaxcala, not for territorial gain, but specifically to capture victims for sacrifice. On the summit of the Templo Maya, the great twin pyramid that stood at the center of Tenochtitlan, priests would perform the solemn ritual. The most common method, the offering of the heart, involved holding the victim down on a sacrificial stone, cutting open the chest with an obsidian blade, and offering the still beating heart to the sun. The body would then be tossed down the temple steps. This act was seen as the highest form of service to the cosmos, a sacred obligation to prevent the sun from stalling and the world from ending. The prophecy for the fifth sun was chillingly specific. It was destined to be destroyed by earthquakes. This looming threat of the ground itself shaking apart made every tremor, no matter how slight, a potential harbinger of the final apocalypse. The constant need for sacrifice created a society living in a state of perpetual, divinely mandated war, a society whose stability depended on a cycle of violence to stave off universal collapse. It was within this deeply spiritual and apprehensive context that a new sun appeared on the eastern horizon in the year 1519. When Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, landed on the Gulf Coast, their arrival coincided with a series of dire omens that had been recorded by Aztec priests in the preceding years. These included a comet streaking across the daytime sky, a mysterious temple fire that could not be extinguished, and the sound of a weeping woman, the goddess Cihuacotl, foretelling the fall of the empire. For many Aztecs, including the Emperor Moctezuma II, the arrival of these pale, bearded men riding mythical deer horses and clad in iron could not have been a mere coincidence. They arrived from the east, the direction sacred to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, had departed over the eastern sea long ago, promising to return one day to reclaim his kingdom. The Spanish ships with their vast sails could easily be interpreted as floating temples or mountains. To a culture primed by prophecy to see signs in every unusual event, the arrival of Cortés and his men was a moment of profound cosmic significance. Some may have seen them as gods or as the literal fulfillment of the Quetzalcoatl prophecy. Others, perhaps more pragmatically, saw them as a powerful new political force to be reckoned with. But the overarching worldview of the fifth sun provided a framework through which these events could be understood. Was this the beginning of the earthquake that would end their world? The Spanish, of course, were not gods but men with very earthly ambitions. Their technological superiority, combined with strategic alliances with the Aztecs' many enemies like the Tlaxcalans, led to a brutal and swift conquest. The siege of Tenochtitlan was a horrifying affair, culminating in the city's fall in 1521. The towering Templo Mayor was torn down, and the stones were used to build a Catholic cathedral directly on top of the sacred precinct. For the Aztecs, this was more than a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. The Spanish had not only stopped the sacrifices, but had also destroyed the very machinery that sustained the sun. In their eyes, the world should have ended, and in a very real sense, their world did end. Their civilization, their religion, and their way of life were systematically dismantled. The prophecy of the fifth sun, therefore, stands as a profound example of how a cultural belief can shape the interpretation of history. It was not that the Aztecs passively accepted their fate because of a prediction. Rather, their entire worldview, centered on cyclical destruction and the need for sacrifice, provided a lens that made the Spanish invasion intelligible, even if it was terrifying. The conquest could be seen as the ultimate, devastating fulfillment of their prophecy, not by a natural earthquake, but by a human cataclysm that shook their empire to its foundations. The story challenges us to consider the power of belief. Did the Aztecs foresee their own downfall, or did the narrative of the five suns ultimately make that downfall, when it came, a recognizable, if tragic, part of their own cosmic story? From the sun-baked pyramids of the Aztecs, we now journey to the misty, loch-strewn landscape of the Scottish Highlands, where a different kind of prophet spoke in riddles that would only make sense generations after his death. In the 17th century, a man named Coinach Odhar, better known as the Brahman seer, wandered the hills of Ross Shire. Unlike the court astrologers of kings, Coinach was a figure of the people, a crofter said to possess the gift of second sight, often activated by looking through a small, hole-pierced stone. His prophecies, passed down through Gaelic oral tradition, were filled with vivid, often bewildering imagery specific to the local geography and clan politics of the Highlands. Among his most puzzling predictions was the assertion that one day, ships of stone would sail up the River Ness. For centuries, this was considered pure fantasy. The River Ness, flowing from the dark waters of Loch Ness to the sea at Inverness, was a fast-moving river entirely unsuited for large vessels. The idea of a ship made of stone was, of course, a physical impossibility. Such a vessel would sink instantly. Listeners would have imagined a magical, mythological event if they gave it any credence at all. The prophecy was filed away as one of the seer's more poetic but nonsensical utterances, a cryptic verse that would never see the light of reality. The world of the Highlands was one of clan battles, cattle raising, and a way of life that had remained largely unchanged for generations. The notion of stone ships was as alien as the idea of the Loch monster that would later captivate the world. The fulfillment of this prophecy began not with magic, but with the ambition of the Industrial Revolution and the genius of a single engineer, Thomas Telford. In the early 19th century, the British government sought a safer route for shipping than the treacherous waters around the northern coast of Scotland, where storms had claimed countless vessels. Telford's solution was one of the most monumental engineering projects of its age, the Caledonian Canal. This incredible waterway would link the North Sea with the Atlantic Ocean by cutting a path through the Great Glen, a natural geological fault line that cradles a chain of lochs, including Loch Ness. The canal would use these vast inland lakes as reservoirs, connecting them with new stretches of manually dug channel and a series of innovative locks. Construction began in 1803, a project of immense scale that would take decades to complete. It was during this construction that the Brahman seer's words began to take on a startling new meaning. The canal required a constant supply of materials, particularly lime for mortar and concrete. To transport these heavy, bulky goods efficiently, Telford and his team used barges. These were not the wooden-hulled ships of the past, but new, robust vessels, And crucially, some of these barges were built with hulls made of concrete, reinforced with iron. Here, then, were the ships of stone. These functional, industrial craft began to sail the newly navigable waters of the canal system, and as the canal reached completion, they indeed traveled up the river Ness through the series of locks that now tamed its flow, right into the heart of Inverness. What had been an impossible riddle for 200 years was suddenly, undeniably true. The prophecy was not about literal floating rocks, but a brilliant, metaphorical description of a technology and an engineering marvel that the seer's own century could not have conceptualized. The story of the stone ships is just one thread in the rich tapestry of the Brahman seer's legacy. He is credited with a host of other predictions that seem to come true long after his time. He foretold the day when fire and water would run in streams through the streets of Inverness, a perfect description of modern gas and water pipes. He predicted the Battle of Culloden and the subsequent Highland clearances, speaking of a time when the sheep will displace the people and the ancient forests of the Highlands will fall. Perhaps most eerily, he prophesied his own grim fate. The legends say that Coinach's downfall came after he insulted the wife of his patron, the Earl of Seaforth. He declared that he saw the Earl in a faraway land, down on one knee, proposing to a beautiful woman while his own wife was at home. Enraged by this accusation of her husband's infidelity, the Countess had the seer arrested, charged with witchcraft, and condemned to death by being burned alive in a barrel of tar at Chanonry Point. As he was led to his execution, Coinach made a final, chilling prophecy. He declared that a white-faced sheep would swim ashore at the point of his death, and that a raven would drink the blood of the Seaforth line. He also proclaimed that the last of the Seaforth chiefs would be deaf, and that after his death, the ancient line would die out. History records that a white-faced sheep did indeed scramble ashore as the smoke rose, and that the main line of the Seaforth Mackenzies did eventually fade away with a deaf chieftain. Whether these details were added later for dramatic effect or represent genuine foresight, they cemented the Brahman seer's reputation as one of Scotland's most compelling prophetic figures. His story is a powerful reminder that prophecies are often not literal blueprints, but poetic visions that require the lens of future technology and social change to be fully understood, showing us that the line between impossible nonsense and stunning accuracy is often just a matter of time. But if the prophecy of the stone ships was a riddle solved by industrial ingenuity, our next example presents a prediction of staggering specificity, one that reads less like a mystical vision and more like a detailed military briefing written centuries in advance. We now turn to the ancient Hebrew scriptures and a series of pronouncements against one of the most powerful and wealthy cities of the ancient world, the Phoenician metropolis of Tyre. Located on the coast of what is now Lebanon, Tyre was actually two cities, a sprawling mainland settlement called Old Tyre, and a seemingly impregnable island fortress situated just off the coast. As a dominant maritime and commercial power, Tyre was synonymous with wealth, pride, and resilience, its walls having repelled the mightiest armies of the age. It is against this backdrop of invincibility that the biblical prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century before the Common Era while exiled in Babylon, delivered a series of devastating prophecies. In the 26th chapter of the book bearing his name, Ezekiel relayed a message of divine judgment against Tyre, and the level of detail is what makes it so remarkable. The prophecy, attributed to the God of Israel, contains several distinct and very specific predictions. First, it declared that many nations would come against Tyre. Second, it foretold that the city's walls would be broken down and its towers shattered. Third, and most strikingly, it predicted that the very debris of the city would be thrown into the water and that the site would be scraped clean like a bare rock, becoming a place where fishermen would spread their nets to dry. For a city famed for its dual nature, the prophecy ominously stated it would become a bare rock in the midst of the sea. The initial fulfillment began not long after Ezekiel's pronouncement. In the years around 570 before the Common Era, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to the mainland city of Tyre. The siege was legendary for its length, lasting 13 years according to some sources. While Nebuchadnezzar eventually succeeded in breaking into the mainland city, he achieved only a partial victory. The Tyrians had simply retreated to their island stronghold, taking their wealth and their fleet with them. The Babylonians, a land-based power with no significant navy, were powerless to assault the island fortress. They destroyed old Tyre, but the heart of the city, its economic and political center, remained untouched and defiant. For a time, it seemed the prophecy had failed. The walls of the mainland were broken, but the island city thrived, and the crucial element of the debris being cast into the sea had not occurred. The stage was now set for one of the most dramatic and brutal engineering projects in military history, an event that would fulfill the prophecy with almost literal precision. 2.5 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar, a new conqueror was sweeping across the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great. After his decisive victory over Emperor Darius at the Battle of Issus in 333 before the Common Era, Alexander marched down the Phoenician coast, accepting the surrenders of most cities. But Tyre, confident in its island fortress, refused to submit. Alexander, recognizing that he could not leave such a powerful naval base in his rear, resolved to take the city. The problem was the half-mile of sea that separated him from his objective. His solution was as audacious as it was simple. He would build a causeway, a massive mole from the mainland to the island. This is where Ezekiel's prophecy finds its breathtaking fulfillment. Alexander ordered his army to use the rubble of the old mainland city, the very city Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed centuries earlier. His soldiers literally scraped the site clean, pulling down every remaining wall and structure, and threw the stones, wood, and dirt into the Mediterranean to build their advancing road. They were, in effect, scraping the city like a bare rock and casting its debris into the water, exactly as Ezekiel had described. The construction was a Herculean task, hampered by Tyrian counterattacks from triremes and divers. Alexander had to build siege towers on the mole for protection and assembled a fleet of his own to eventually blockade the island. After 7 grueling months, the causeway was complete, and Alexander's forces stormed the walls, unleashing a brutal sack. The city was utterly destroyed, and thousands of its inhabitants were slaughtered or sold into slavery. True to the prophecy, the once great city was reduced to a barren rock, and for centuries afterward, the area was known as a place where fishermen dried their nets. The precision of this prophecy makes it a focal point for both theological and historical debate. For believers, it stands as powerful evidence of divine foreknowledge, a prediction so detailed and accurately fulfilled that it transcends coincidence. Skeptics, however, offer a different interpretation. They suggest that Ezekiel, as a knowledgeable figure of his time, was making a logical geopolitical forecast. Tyre was a wealthy rival, and its destruction by a rising power was a plausible outcome. The image of scraping a city clean could be a known metaphor for total destruction in ancient Near Eastern warfare. Furthermore, the prophecy's timeline is complex. The initial siege by Nebuchadnezzar did not fully fulfill the prediction, requiring a second event with Alexander to complete it. This has led some to argue that the prophecy was edited or refined after the fact to fit the known historical outcome, a common practice in ancient texts. Regardless of one's perspective, the story of Tyre remains a compelling case study. It demonstrates how ancient prophecies were deeply intertwined with the realities of power, siege warfare, and the fate of cities, and how a specific prediction could echo through the centuries, waiting for a determined conqueror to make it a startling reality. Yet, even the most dramatic political prophecies can be overshadowed by the most intimate and personal of warnings, a premonition whispered not from a temple oracle but from a troubled dream. From the grand fall of empires, we now turn to a single, fateful morning in Rome. to the private chambers of the most powerful man in the world and to a wife's terrifying vision. The date was the 15th of March, 44 years before the Common Era, a day known as the Ides of March. Julius Caesar, having been declared dictator for life, was at the absolute peak of his power, but that power had created a seething cauldron of resentment among the traditionalist elite of the Roman Senate. A conspiracy was brewing, led by men Caesar considered friends and even a son, Marcus Junius Brutus. On the night of the 14th, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, was gripped by a nightmare of such visceral horror that it would be remembered for millennia. The Roman historian Plutarch, writing about these events over 100 years later, gives us the haunting details. Calpurnia dreamed that the pediment, the ornate triangular top of their house, had collapsed in a heap of rubble. But even more chillingly, she dreamed that she was holding her murdered husband in her arms, his body bleeding from multiple wounds. She awoke in a panic, convinced the dream was a direct warning from the gods. As dawn broke on the Ides of March, she pleaded with Caesar not to leave the house. She argued that the Senate meeting he planned to attend should be postponed, citing both her dream and the reports of unfavorable omens that the priest had observed during recent sacrifices. Caesar was a practical man, a military genius who had built his career on decisive action, not superstition. He was initially dismissive, yet Calpurnia's distress was so profound, her fear so palpable that it began to shake his resolve. He was not a man easily frightened, but the raw emotion of his wife's appeal gave him pause. He even considered sending his second-in-command, Marcus Antonius, to dismiss the Senate for the day. It was at this critical moment of hesitation that the conspirators, fearing their meticulously laid plan was about to unravel, sent one of their own to intervene. Decimus Brutus Albinus, a close associate of Caesar and a key member of the plot, arrived at the house. He used all his powers of persuasion, first mocking the notion of taking a woman's dream seriously, and then appealing to Caesar's pride. He asked if Caesar really wanted to give the Senate the impression that he was taking orders from his wife. He assured Caesar that the senators were ready to bestow upon him the ultimate honor, the title of king for all the provinces outside of Italy. This combination of flattery and peer pressure was enough to push Caesar over the edge. He agreed to go. The scene that followed is one of the most iconic in history. Caesar made his way to the theater of Pompey where the Senate was meeting. On his way, he was handed a note by a teacher named Artemidorus, which detailed the entire conspiracy and named the conspirators. Caesar, however, distracted by other petitioners, never read it. He entered the chamber and took his seat. The conspirators gathered around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then the attack began. Casca struck the first blow, a glancing dagger thrust to the neck. Caesar turned and caught him, famously gasping in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" What happened next was a frenzy of violence. The entire group of senators, dozens of men, descended upon him, each wanting to claim a part in the deed. Caesar tried to fight back, but when he saw Marcus Brutus among his attackers, he uttered the words immortalized by Shakespeare, "You too, my child." He then pulled his toga over his head and succumbed to the onslaught, falling at the base of a statue of his former rival, Pompey. He was stabbed 23 times. So was Calpurnia's dream a genuine prophecy? From a skeptical viewpoint, it is a perfect example of a literary device. Plutarch and other historians like Suetonius were master storytellers, not just dry chroniclers of fact. The dream serves as a powerful dramatic tool, creating suspense and foreshadowing the tragic event. It introduces the theme of fate versus free will. Caesar is warned, yet he chooses to walk into his doom, making his fall that much more poignant. It is entirely plausible that the story of the dream was embellished or even invented after the fact to add a layer of tragic inevitability to the assassination. After all, in the aftermath of such an earth-shattering event, people naturally look for signs that it was meant to be. However, there is another, more psychological possibility. Rome in the 1st century before the Common Era was a city thick with rumors and political intrigue. Calpurnia, as the wife of the most powerful and controversial man in Rome, would have been acutely attuned to the undercurrents of danger. She would have heard the whispers, sensed the tension, and seen the furtive glances between men who were supposed to be loyal. Her subconscious mind, working through the night, could have synthesized all these subtle cues into a coherent, terrifying narrative, the dream. It may not have been divine foresight, but rather a profound human intuition, a gut feeling manifested in the symbolic language of sleep. Her prophecy, therefore, stands as a timeless story of a warning unheeded, a moment where a personal premonition, whether supernatural or deeply intuitive, collided with the unstoppable tide of history, leaving us to wonder what might have been if a great man had only listened to the fears of the woman who loved him. Crossing the globe once more, we find ourselves in the heart of ancient China, where the mandate to rule was believed to be granted by heaven itself, and where a single, seemingly minor omen could signal the end of an entire epoch. Our story unfolds during the final years of the Shang dynasty, a period traditionally dated to around 1046 years before the Common Era. The Shang was one of China's earliest dynasties, a Bronze Age civilization known for its sophisticated artistry in jade and bronze, and for the practice of divination using oracle bones. But its last ruler, King Zhu of Shang, would become the archetypal tyrant in Chinese history, a figure whose name became synonymous with decadence, cruelty, and the catastrophic loss of the mandate of heaven. And his downfall, according to legend, was foretold by a simple yet profoundly significant prophecy involving a white snake. The story, preserved in texts like the Bamboo Annals and immortalized in later historical works and folklore, begins with King Zhu performing a sacrifice at the ancestral temple of his dynasty. During this solemn ceremony, an event of great portent occurred. A white snake, a creature imbued with deep symbolic meaning in Chinese culture, appeared before him. In ancient Chinese cosmology, colors and animals were never arbitrary. They were part of a complex system of correspondences. The color white was associated with the West, with the season of autumn, and with the element of metal, all symbols of endings, of harvest, and of cutting down. More specifically, the white snake was often seen as an omen of death and the collapse of a ruling house. For the king's ministers and court astrologers, trained in interpreting the will of heaven through such signs, the appearance of this creature during a sacred ritual was a moment of sheer terror. It was a direct, unambiguous message from the ancestors. The Shang dynasty's time was up. The king's most loyal and virtuous advisors, including his uncle Bai Gan and the minister Jizi, urgently warned him. They interpreted the omen as a divine rebuke, a sign that King Zhu's own behavior was causing him to lose the favor of heaven. They pleaded with him to change his ways, to abandon his cruel practices and govern with benevolence, lest the prophecy be fulfilled. But King Zhu, arrogant and secure in his power, dismissed their warnings with contempt. He was, by all accounts, a man of immense intelligence and physical strength, but these qualities were corrupted by a boundless appetite for luxury and a sadistic streak. The traditional narratives describe his infamous meat forest and wine pool, extravagant feasts where guests would chase each other through a forest of hanging meat and drink from a lake of wine. He was said to have invented terrible tortures such as the burning pillar, a bronze cylinder heated red-hot that he would force victims to embrace. When his uncle Bai Gan persisted in his admonitions, King Zhu, in an act of ultimate barbarity, reportedly had his heart cut out, declaring he wanted to see if the heart of a sage had 7 orifices as legend claimed. The prophecy of the white snake, however, was not merely a supernatural warning. It was also a political catalyst. While King Zhu spiraled into tyranny, a virtuous and ambitious leader was rising in the West. This was King Wu of the Zhou, a people who had long been vassals of the Shang. The Zhou rulers, particularly King Wu's father, King Wen, were celebrated for their wisdom and just rule. They watched as the Shang dynasty under King Zhou alienated its allies and oppressed its people. The appearance of the white snake omen would have been seen by the Zhou and by discontented Shang subjects not as a curse but as a confirmation. Heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the corrupt Shang and was preparing to bestow it upon a more worthy house. This concept, the mandate of heaven, is the cornerstone of ancient Chinese political philosophy. It posits that a ruler governs only with heaven's approval, which is demonstrated by peace, prosperity, and order. When a ruler becomes unjust, heaven sends signs, natural disasters, strange omens as warnings. If the ruler fails to correct his course, the mandate is withdrawn, and rebellion is not just permitted, it is divinely sanctioned. Thus, the prophecy legitimized the Zhou uprising. King Wu gathered a coalition of disaffected states and marched to confront the Shang army. The decisive battle took place at Mui. Despite being significantly outnumbered, the Zhou forces were fueled by a sense of righteous purpose. The Shang army, demoralized and composed largely of conscripted soldiers and slaves, put up little resistance. In fact, many Shang troops are said to have defected to the Zhou side during the battle, turning their weapons against their own king. Abandoned and facing certain defeat, King Zhou retreated to his palace, donned his most precious jewels, and set it ablaze, perishing in the flames. The Shang dynasty was over, and the long-reigning Zhou dynasty began, establishing a political and cultural legacy that would shape China for centuries. This story, so central to China's historical identity, is vividly captured in the art of later periods. Ming and Qing dynasty paintings often depict the Battle of Mu with a dramatic, swirling energy, showing King Wu as a heroic figure leading a righteous charge. Other artworks focus on the tragic moments within the Shang court, such as the loyal Bai Gan offering his fatal advice to a disdainful King Zhou. These images served a moral and political purpose, reinforcing the lesson that tyranny inevitably leads to downfall, and that heaven's will, once made clear through prophecy, is an unstoppable force. The prophecy of the white snake, therefore, is far more than a curious legend. It is a foundational narrative about the mechanics of power in ancient China, a powerful illustration of how omens and prophecies were integral to statecraft, providing both a warning to corrupt rulers and a divine justification for the rise of new dynasties that would claim they were destined to restore balance and virtue to the world. While the prophecies we have explored so far have warned of personal doom or national collapse, some of the most fascinating predictions are those that seem to outline a specific political sequence, a pattern of power that resonates through history. This brings us to a deeply obscure but profoundly influential Roman prophecy, one that was guarded within the sacred Sibylline Books themselves. It was said that 3 men from the patrician clan of the Cornelii would each, in turn, hold supreme power in Rome. In a society where family name was synonymous with destiny, this was not a vague forecast, it was a detailed blueprint for the unraveling of the Republic. To understand its chilling accuracy, we must first step into the turbulent world of the late 2nd and early 1st centuries before the Common Era, a time when the traditional foundations of Roman government were beginning to crack under the weight of its own immense empire. The Roman Republic was not a democracy as we know it, but a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent any single individual from seizing control. Power was shared between the Senate, the popular assemblies, and annually elected magistrates, most importantly the 2 consuls. This system had worked for centuries, but by the time of the Gracchi brothers in the late 2nd century, it was under immense strain. The vast wealth and new slave labor flooding into Rome from its conquests had created a yawning gap between the rich and the poor. Ambitious politicians began to bypass the Senate, appealing directly to the masses of disaffected urban poor and veteran soldiers for support. This populist tactic shattered political norms and set a dangerous precedent. Power could now be won with an army at your back rather than through senatorial consensus. It was into this volatile atmosphere that the prophecy of the three Cornelii was whispered, a prediction that seemed to promise a very specific kind of strongman rule. The Cornelii were one of the oldest and most powerful patrician families in Rome, a name that carried the weight of history. Figures like Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal, were Cornelii. So the prophecy immediately commanded attention. It pointed to men of inherent prestige. The first of the three is identified by later historians as Lucius Cornelius Cinna. In the year 87 before the Common Era, Cinna, as consul, ignited a civil war against his rival Sulla, who had marched his army on Rome itself, an unprecedented and sacrilegious act. While Sulla was away fighting a war in the east, Cinna seized control of the city, ruling with an iron fist for 4 years alongside his ally Gaius Marius. Cinna's regime was marked by proscriptions, the public listing of political enemies who could be killed with impunity, and the violent suppression of opposition. He was, for all intents and purposes, the master of Rome, the first Cornelii to fulfill the prophecy's grim promise of singular power. The second figure was even more formidable, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. When Sulla returned from the east, he plunged Italy into a bloody civil war, ultimately defeating the factions loyal to Marius and Cinna. Victorious, Sulla had the Senate appoint him to an extraordinary office not used for over a century, dictator. But this was not the 6-month emergency magistracy of old. Sulla was appointed dictator legibus faciendis et republici constituendi, for the making of laws and the settling of the constitution. It was a blank check for absolute power with no fixed term limit. For 2 years, Sulla used this authority to ruthlessly restructure the Roman state to favor the Senate and crush the power of the popular assemblies. His proscriptions were on a scale previously unimaginable, with thousands of wealthy Romans murdered and their property auctioned off to enrich Sulla's supporters. He was the prophecy's second strongman, a Cornelii who held power more absolutely than any Roman before him. But the prophecy's most astonishing twist lay in the identity of the third man. The name given was Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix Sulla the Fortunate. This was not a different person, but the same Sulla, now bearing the agnomen Felix to celebrate his divine luck. The prophecy, therefore, was not strictly linear. It foretold that the same man would hold supreme power twice, but under a different formulation of his authority. This is exactly what happened. Sulla's first period of dominance was as a conquering general who seized the city by force. His second, and far more significant, period was his official dictatorship, where he wielded power with the formal, chilling sanction of the Roman constitution. After believing his work was complete, Sulla did something no other dictator would ever do. He voluntarily resigned his absolute power and retired to private life, a move that shocked his contemporaries. He died shortly thereafter, but the precedent he set was catastrophic. He had demonstrated that the Republic's laws could be bent to legitimize a monarchy in all but name. In retrospect, this Sibylline prophecy was seen as a terrifyingly accurate roadmap for the end of the Republic's stability. The reigns of Cinna and Sulla shattered every taboo. They normalized political violence, militarized politics, and showed that the state's institutions were ultimately powerless against a determined general with a loyal army. The prophecy's power lay in its specificity. The focus on the Cornelii name gave Romans a lens through which to understand the chaos. It wasn't random misfortune. It was a destiny playing out with 3 acts, culminating in the unprecedented spectacle of a dictator who crowned himself with a title of divine favor and then walked away. This narrative of a predetermined cycle of strongmen provided a sense of order, even a grim comfort, in a time of terrifying disorder. It suggested that the crisis had a shape and perhaps an endpoint. The prophecy of the 3 Cornelii stands as a masterclass in how ancient predictions could become self-fulfilling, shaping political ambition and historical interpretation alike, and setting the stage for the even greater autocrats like Julius Caesar who would follow in their footsteps. Now we cross the English Channel to a land steeped in its own legendary past, where the figure of a mysterious prophet would be resurrected to make sense of a bloody and chaotic civil war. In the 15th century, England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a decades-long struggle for the throne between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. It was an era of shifting alliances, sudden betrayals, and a pervasive sense of uncertainty, where the rightful claim to the crown was constantly debated. In such turbulent times, people looked for reassurance, for a sign that the chaos had a pattern and that their side was destined to win. They found this divine roadmap not in a new vision, but in a very old one, attributed to the most famous seer of British legend, Merlin. The source of these prophecies was Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 1130s. This work, a sprawling and fanciful account of British history from its mythical founding by the Trojan Brutus, included a section of prophecies spoken by Merlin. These were not clear, straightforward predictions. They were dense, allegorical, and filled with animal symbolism: a wolf, a lion, a dragon, and crucially, a boar. Geoffrey presented them as relating to events in the distant past from his perspective, but their cryptic nature made them a perfect blank slate for future generations. Centuries later, during the Wars of the Roses, these obscure verses were taken out of their original context and enthusiastically reapplied to the contemporary conflict. Both sides pored over the texts, each convinced that Merlin's ancient words foretold their ultimate victory. One prophecy in particular captured the imagination of the Yorkist faction. It spoke of a mighty boar of Cornwall who would grind the teeth of its jaws and crush the forests of Gaul. For the Yorkists, this was a perfect description of their charismatic and formidable leader, King Edward IV. Edward's personal emblem was the white boar, a badge proudly worn by his most loyal supporters. He was known for his immense height, his military prowess, and his vigorous, some would say ruthless, nature, all qualities easily associated with the powerful and destructive boar of legend. His decisive victory over the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in 1461, a brutal engagement fought in a blinding snowstorm that cemented his claim to the throne, was seen as the direct fulfillment of Merlin's words. The boar had indeed ground its teeth, scattering its enemies and seizing control of the kingdom. But the true power of these Merlin prophecies lay in their flexibility. They were a form of political cryptography where the same verse could be interpreted in multiple ways to suit the needs of the moment. When Edward IV later fell out with his most powerful ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, the Lancastrians quickly adopted the same prophecy. They now argued that the boar of Cornwall was not Edward at all, but rather referred to Warwick himself, whose influence was so great he could make and unmake kings. This reinterpretation gave the Lancastrian cause a divine legitimacy it had previously lacked, demonstrating that prophecy was less about revealing a fixed future and more about providing a persuasive narrative in the present. The verses became weapons in a propaganda war, tools to bolster morale, attract undecided nobles, and justify rebellion. This practice of tailoring ancient prophecies to modern conflicts reveals a fascinating blend of Celtic myth and calculated political strategy. The figure of Merlin lent an air of immense antiquity and mystical authority to a partisan claim. By linking their struggle to the legendary past of King Arthur and his prophet, the warring factions elevated a messy political and dynastic squabble into a chapter in a grand national epic. It was a way of saying that their fight was not just about power, but about fulfilling Britain's destined path. The prophecies attributed to Merlin during the Wars of the Roses stand as a powerful example of how the past is constantly reimagined to serve the needs of the present, showing us that sometimes the most influential prophecies are not those that predict the future, but those that are skillfully rewritten to explain it. Yet another dramatic chapter in the long history of the Oracle of Delphi would be written just a few decades after the fall of King Croesus, and this time the fate of not just a kingdom but of an entire civilization seemed to hang in the balance. The year was 480 before the Common Era, and a storm of unimaginable scale was gathering in the east. Xerxes, the great king of Persia, son of Darius, was amassing the largest army and navy the world had ever seen, a multinational force of hundreds of thousands with the singular goal of subjugating the fractious and proud city-states of Greece. As this colossal war machine began its slow march westward, panic spread through the Greek world. The city of Athens, in particular, knew it was a primary target, seeking revenge for its role in defeating the Persians at the Battle of Marathon a decade earlier. With desperation mounting, the Athenians did what all Greeks did in a moment of existential crisis. They sent a delegation to Delphi, seeking a way to survive the coming apocalypse. The initial response from the Pythia was not just discouraging, it was utterly terrifying. As recorded by the historian Herodotus, the priestess met them with a vision of unmitigated doom. She prophesied a scene of absolute desolation, temples and sacred places set ablaze, their blood running down the streets and their citizens fleeing in terror. The message was clear: stay and fight for your city, and you will be annihilated. The delegation was so horrified that they considered the mission a failure. But on the advice of a local Delphian, they approached the oracle a second time, this time as supplicants carrying olive branches, a symbol of surrender to the divine will, and pleaded for a slightly less bleak forecast. Moved by their humility, the Pythia offered a second, more nuanced prophecy. This one contained a single, cryptic phrase that would become the subject of the most critical debate in Athenian history. She declared that a wooden wall alone would be saved, and that this wooden wall would not be taken by the Persians. Furthermore, she made a mysterious reference to divine Salamis, predicting that this place would bring death to the sons of women, but only when the grain was scattered or when it was gathered. The delegates carefully recorded these enigmatic words and carried them back to Athens, where their meaning would be fiercely contested. Upon their return, the Athenian assembly convened in a state of high anxiety to decipher the oracle's message. The debate centered entirely on the meaning of the wooden wall. The most traditional and conservative interpretation, championed by the older and more cautious citizens, was that it referred to the ancient wooden palisade, the Acropolis wall, that surrounded the city's sacred high ground. Their plan was simple: fortify this existing barrier, stockpile supplies, and make a desperate last stand on the Acropolis, trusting that the prophecy meant the gods would protect this specific holy ground. This seemed like the safest, most literal reading of the oracle's words, but one man, a visionary and cunning politician named Themistocles, stood up and presented a radical, alternative interpretation. He argued that the wooden wall could not possibly mean the old palisade. Why would the oracle say it alone would be saved, only to then describe the city's utter destruction in the first prophecy? Themistocles insisted the wooden wall was a metaphor for the city's fleet of 200 triremes, the wooden warships he had brilliantly persuaded the Athenians to build a few years earlier using the profits from a newly discovered silver vein. Themistocles' argument was a masterstroke of political persuasion and strategic genius. He connected the wooden wall directly to the other part of the prophecy, divine Salamis. Salamis was the narrow strait between the Athenian coast and the island of Salamis. Themistocles interpreted the puzzling line about death to the sons of women and the scattered grain not as a prediction of Athenian defeat, but as a description of the chaotic and confined nature of a naval battle in those waters, a battle where the Persians, with their vastly larger but less maneuverable fleet, would be at a fatal disadvantage. He convinced the assembly that the gods were not telling them to hide behind a wall and die, but to abandon their city, trust in their ships, and lure the Persian navy into a trap. It was an incredibly risky and emotionally wrenching proposal. It meant voluntarily evacuating the entire population of Attica, men, women, and children. to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese, leaving Athens itself to be occupied and burned by the Persians. Themistocles was asking the Athenians to bet everything, their entire past and future, on his reading of a poetic riddle. The course they chose would change the world. The Athenians, persuaded by Themistocles, voted for the evacuation. As Xerxes' army advanced, they watched from their ships as their beloved city was indeed captured and put to the torch, just as the first, darker prophecy had foretold. But this was the sacrifice that made victory possible. The Persian fleet, flush with confidence, sailed into the Straits of Salamis exactly as Themistocles had planned. In the narrow waters, their numerical superiority became a crippling liability. The lighter, more agile Greek triremes, manned by citizens fighting for their very existence, rammed and destroyed ship after ship. The battle was a spectacular and decisive victory for the Greeks. Xerxes, watching the destruction of his navy from a golden throne on the shore, was forced to retreat, effectively ending his invasion. The wooden wall of the Athenian navy had indeed saved them, and divine Salamis had been the scene of the Persians' ruin. The story of the wooden walls stands as perhaps the ultimate example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Its power lay not in its predetermined certainty, but in the brilliant interpretation that gave a people the courage to make an impossible choice. Had the Athenians chosen the literalist reading and fortified the Acropolis, history records that a small group who did just that were massacred by the Persians. The prophecy would have been true in its darkest sense. Instead, Themistocles' metaphorical and strategic interpretation unlocked a different future. This event underscores a profound truth about ancient prophecy. It was rarely a simple fortune to be passively received. It was a dynamic dialogue between the divine and the human, a puzzle that required wisdom, courage, and sometimes sheer audacity to solve correctly. The salvation of Greece was not written solely in the cryptic words of the Pythia, but in the mind of the statesman who understood that the gods help those who are brave enough to rethink the very definition of a wall. Yet another prophecy, born in a time of fire and persecution, would offer a framework for understanding the collapse of the world's greatest empire. For the early Christians living under Roman rule, the world was a terrifying place. They were a small, persecuted sect, often scapegoated for plagues and political unrest, forced to worship in secret for fear of arrest, torture, and execution in the arenas. From their perspective, Rome was not a beacon of civilization but a monstrous beast, a corrupt and idolatrous power that demanded worship of its emperors and reveled in violence. It was within this context of oppression and hope for divine justice that one of the most influential prophecies in Western history was composed, the vision of the fall of the city on 7 hills. The source is the final book of the New Testament, the Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John. Written near the end of the 1st century, likely during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, its pages are a fever dream of symbolic imagery, multi-headed beasts, dragons, cosmic battles, and a triumphant Lamb of God. Central to this vision is the condemnation of a great city, referred to cryptically as Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. But within the text lies a specific, identifying clue. Chapter 17, verse 9 states, "This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits." For any reader in the ancient Mediterranean world, the identification was instant and unmistakable. Rome was famously known as the Urbs Septicolis, the city of 7 hills, the Palatine, Capitoline, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, Caelian, and Aventine. The woman symbolizing the city is described as being drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. For the persecuted Christian communities, this was not a vague allegory. It was a thinly veiled and powerful indictment of the empire that was actively spilling their blood. The prophecy foretold that this blasphemous city would face a catastrophic and fiery judgment. Revelation chapter 18 describes its fall in vivid, poetic detail. woe. Woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon! In 1 hour your doom has come. It predicts merchants and kings, those who grew rich from Rome's commerce, standing far off, weeping as they watch the smoke of her burning. This was not just a prediction of political change, it was a declaration of divine retribution. The prophecy gave suffering Christians a profound sense of hope and vindication. It assured them that their tormentor, despite its invincible appearance, was not eternal. God's justice would prevail, and the empire that had martyred their brothers and sisters would be utterly destroyed, becoming a haunt for demons and a home for every unclean spirit. For the first 3 centuries, this prophecy remained a desperate hope. Rome seemed more powerful than ever, its legions unassailable, its empire stretching from Britain to the Euphrates. The great persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian must have felt like the final, brutal onslaught of the beast described in Revelation. But then, in a turn of events that must have seemed nothing short of miraculous, the empire's relationship with Christianity flipped entirely. Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in the 4th century legalized the faith, and within decades, Christianity became the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This presented a profound theological problem. How could the Holy Christian Church now be in alliance with the very Babylon it was supposed to condemn? A new interpretation emerged, one that spiritualized the prophecy. Perhaps Babylon referred not to the political empire of Rome, but to the persistent worldly forces of sin and paganism that still existed within it. The city of God, as St. Augustine would later articulate, was now struggling against the city of man within the same geographical space. This delicate reinterpretation was shattered in the 5th century. The unthinkable happened. Wave after wave of invasions by Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns under Attila, crashed against the weakening frontiers of the Western Roman Empire. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked the city of Rome itself, an event that sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Then, in 476, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. The Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. For Christians who remembered the old prophecy, this was not a random historical catastrophe. It was the literal, breathtaking fulfillment of John's vision. The mighty city on 7 hills, the persecutor of the saints, had indeed fallen. The 1 hour of its doom had arrived just as foretold. The event was seen as a direct act of God, a divine judgment that validated their faith and their scriptures. The contrast with the Eastern Roman Empire, however, added a fascinating layer of complexity to this narrative. While the city of Rome and the Western Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. How could this be reconciled with the prophecy? Byzantine Christians, who considered themselves the true heirs of Rome, developed their own interpretation. They argued that the prophecy of Babylon's fall was specifically about the city of Old Rome, which had been the seat of pagan persecution. Their empire, the Christian Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, was a different entity altogether, the New Rome, the protector of the faith. The fall of the West was therefore a purification, a punishment for the old sins of paganism, while the East endured as God's chosen instrument on earth. This belief fortified the Byzantine Empire's identity for centuries, even as its territories gradually shrank, until Constantinople itself finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The long-term impact of this prophecy on Christian views of history and empire cannot be overstated. It established a powerful paradigm of historical interpretation, that empires rise and fall according to a divine plan, and that their fates are directly linked to their moral and spiritual standing. This worldview would echo through the centuries. During the Protestant Reformation, reformers like Martin Luther would apply the Babylon label to the papacy in Rome, seeing the Catholic Church as a new, corrupt iteration of the persecuting empire. Later, during periods of war and revolution, various factions would identify their enemies with the beast of Revelation. The prophecy of the City of Seven Hills created a lasting template for understanding political power through a spiritual lens, teaching believers to look for the hand of providence in the tumultuous currents of history, and forever linking the destiny of faith to the fate of empires. But if the fall of Rome was seen as a divine judgment from afar, our next prophecy brings us into the heart of a sacred space, to a moment of chilling personal foresight that would transform a political murder into a legendary martyrdom. We travel now to 12th century England, to the towering, magnificent Canterbury Cathedral, and to the escalating, poisonous feud between a king and his former friend. The story of Thomas Becket is one of the most dramatic in medieval history, a tale of a dramatic transformation. Becket began as a worldly and sophisticated courtier, a close companion of the vibrant young King Henry II, who appointed him to the powerful position of Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Henry believed he was placing a loyal ally in the church's highest office, a man who would help him curb the growing power of the ecclesiastical courts. But to Henry's astonishment and fury, Becket underwent a profound change. Upon becoming archbishop, he shed his luxurious lifestyle, embraced asceticism, and became a fierce, unyielding defender of the church's independence from royal control. The conflict came to a head over the issue of what to do with criminous clerks, members of the clergy who committed crimes. Henry insisted they should be tried and punished in royal courts. Becket argued they were subject only to church courts, which could not impose the death penalty. This was more than a legal technicality. It was a fundamental struggle over the balance of power between crown and cross. The relationship soured into bitter enmity. After a series of confrontations, Becket was forced into exile in France for 6 years. A tense reconciliation was brokered in 1170, and Becket returned to Canterbury. But the peace was fragile. Almost immediately, Becket provoked the king anew by excommunicating several bishops who had supported the king during his exile. It was at this moment of peak tension, with a Christmas court at Bar-le-Roi in Normandy, that King Henry II, in a fit of rage, uttered the words that would echo through history, though their exact phrasing is debated by chroniclers. He cried out something to the effect of, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" Or, more famously in the popular version, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" This rhetorical outburst, whether a literal command or an anguished complaint, was taken as a royal order by four. His knights, Reginald Fitz-Urse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, swiftly crossed the Channel and rode to Canterbury. They arrived on the 29th of December, 1170, and confronted the archbishop inside the cathedral itself, near the door to the monastic cloister. They demanded he absolve the excommunicated bishops and submit to the king's authority. Becket refused. The knights retreated to arm themselves, while Becket was persuaded by his attendants to proceed into the cathedral for vespers. It is here, in the growing twilight of the cathedral, that the prophecy enters the story. According to accounts written by his close followers shortly after his death, Thomas Becket had a profound sense of foreboding about his return to England. He is said to have spoken openly of his belief that he was going back to die. In one particularly poignant moment, he supposedly prophesied that his conflict with the king would end only with his own martyrdom, telling his companions that he went to Canterbury to be killed. This was not a vague fear. It was presented as a clear and accepted premonition of his fate. As the armed knights stormed back into the cathedral, shouting for the archbishop, Becket's clerks tried to bar the doors to the choir, but he himself prevented them, stating, "The church shall not be turned into a castle." He stood his ground near the steps to the altar of Saint Benedict. The knights, their swords drawn, again demanded he yield. His final words were a defiant, "For the name of Jesus and the protection of the church, I am ready to embrace death." What followed was an act of sacrilege that horrified all of Christendom. The first blow, likely from Reginald Fitzurse, struck the top of his head, slicing off his scalp. A second blow felled him. As he lay on the stone floor, one of the knights placed his foot on Becket's neck, scattered his brains with the point of his sword, and declared, "He will rise no more." The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral, a place of sanctuary, was an unimaginable crime. The question that historians have grappled with for centuries is whether Becket's prophecy was a genuine glimpse of his future or a powerful piece of hagiography crafted after the fact. Skeptics make a compelling case. The biographies that record his premonitions were written by men like John of Salisbury and Edward Grimm, who were devoted to Becket and deeply invested in promoting his sainthood. Attributing a prophecy of martyrdom to him served a crucial purpose. It transformed a violent political killing into a willing, Christ-like sacrifice. It suggested that Becket was not a victim of random brutality, but a holy man who knowingly walked toward his death in defense of his principles, sanctifying his cause and damning his murderers and the king who inspired them. In this view, the prophecy is a literary and theological device designed to strengthen the cult that sprang up around him almost immediately. Yet there is another, more psychological possibility. Becket was an intelligent and acutely political man. He understood the temperament of King Henry better than anyone. He knew that his actions upon returning to England, especially the excommunications, were a direct and unforgivable challenge to royal authority. He must have known that Henry's rage would be uncontrollable. His prophecy could therefore be seen as a realistic assessment of the inevitable outcome of his steadfastness. It was less a mystical vision and more a cold, calculated recognition that his defiance would lead to his death. This interpretation does not diminish its power, it simply roots it in human courage rather than divine foresight. He chose principle over self-preservation, fully aware of the likely cost. The aftermath of the murder was a tidal wave of religious and political change. King Henry II was plunged into a crisis of legitimacy. The public outrage was so immense that he was forced to perform a very public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and submitting to a scourging by the cathedral's monks. Becket was canonized as a saint just 2 years later in 1172, and his shrine at Canterbury became one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in all of Europe, a status immortalized centuries later by Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. The prophecy, whether literally true or not, became an inseparable part of the legend of St. Thomas of Canterbury, a story forever checked the power of the English monarchy and established a powerful precedent for the moral authority of the Church, all born from a king's angry words and an archbishop's steadfast refusal to yield. High in the thin air of the Andes, where the sky seems to touch the peaks of the mountains, the Inca Empire stood as a masterpiece of human organization and ambition. By the early 16th century, it was the largest empire in the world, a sprawling realm connected by a network of roads and bridges that stretched for thousands of miles from modern-day Colombia down to Chile. The Incas called their empire Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, and they believed their ruler, the Sopa Inca, was the divine son of the sun god Inti. His authority was absolute, his presence sacred. Yet, even as the empire reached its zenith under the reign of Huayna Capac, a shadow fell across the land, a premonition whispered not by a human oracle, but by the very forces of nature themselves. According to chronicles written after the conquest, based on the oral histories of the Inca nobility, Huayna Capac was leading his armies in a campaign to conquer new territories in the north, in what is now Ecuador, when strange and unsettling omens began to appear. The most significant of these was a profound and persistent vision. It was said that the emperor dreamed or perhaps received a vision from the priests of bearded men, unlike any people he had ever seen, who would arrive from across the sea. These mysterious figures would bring about the downfall of his empire. In some versions of the story, this was accompanied by other portents, comets streaking across the night sky, or earthquakes shaking the foundations of the mountains. For a culture as deeply attuned to the spiritual significance of natural events as the Inca, these were not mere curiosities. They were direct communications from the gods, warnings of a cataclysm to come. The prophecy was deeply intertwined with Inca cosmology, which was fundamentally cyclical. They believed in ages of creation and destruction, much like the Aztecs and the Maya. A central part of their creation myth involved the god Viracocha, who, after a great flood, emerged from Lake Titicaca and created a new race of humans. After his work was done, Viracocha walked across the waters of the Pacific Ocean, promising to return one day. This legend created a powerful cultural template, a powerful, pale, bearded god who came from the water and possessed world-altering power. When Huayna Capac received his vision of bearded men, it would have resonated with this ancient story of Viracocha, blurring the lines between a divine return and an existential threat. The prophecy, therefore, was not just a prediction of invasion, it was layered with profound theological ambiguity. Were these beings gods or were they destroyers? The message was terrifyingly unclear. Tragically, Huayna Capac himself would not live to see the fulfillment of his own premonition. Around 1525, before any Europeans had even set foot in the heartland of the empire, a devastating epidemic swept down from the north. This was likely smallpox or measles, diseases brought to the Americas by the Spanish, which had raced ahead of the conquistadors themselves, traveling along indigenous trade routes. The disease struck the Inca court with horrific force. Huayna Capac, along with his designated heir, Ninancayochi, succumbed to the illness. Their sudden deaths created a catastrophic power vacuum. The empire was plunged into a brutal civil war between two of Huayna Capac's other sons, the half-brothers Atahualpa and Huascar. This war tore Tawantinsuyu apart, decimating its armies and shattering the unity that had been its greatest strength. The prophecy was beginning its work even before the bearded men arrived, as if the mere anticipation of their coming had weakened the empire from within. It was into this fractured and vulnerable world that Francisco Pizarro and his band of 168 conquistadors landed in 1532. To the Incas, these men were the living embodiment of the prophecy. They arrived from the sea on giant houses, their sailing ships. They had pale skin, wore clothes of metal, and most strikingly, they had beards. They rode animals that were unlike anything in the Americas, giant beasts that were half man and half beast to the Inca eye, the Spanish horses. When Pizarro marched inland to the highland town of Cajamarca, he sent a message to the victorious Atahualpa, who was resting there after defeating his brother. Atahualpa, aware of the strange newcomers, agreed to a meeting. He felt no fear. He was the ruler of millions, attended by an army of thousands of seasoned veterans. What threat could this tiny group of foreigners possibly pose? The scene that unfolded in the plaza of Cajamarca on November 16, 1532, is a stark illustration of how prophecy can instill a fatal hesitation. Atahualpa arrived in a magnificent litter carried by 80 high-ranking lords, surrounded by thousands of his best soldiers, who were, however, largely unarmed as a sign of peaceful intent for the parley. The Spanish, hidden in the buildings surrounding the square, were terrified, but they had a plan. A Dominican friar, Vicente de Valverde, approached Atahualpa with a Bible and a cross, attempting to explain the tenets of Christianity through a translator and demanding the Inca accept the authority of the Pope and the Spanish king. Atahualpa, a god-king in his own right, was insulted. He took the Bible, examined it, shook it, and threw it to the ground, demanding to know where the friar's god was. This act of defiance gave the Spanish the pretext they needed. Pizarro gave the signal, and the conquistadors unleashed a horrifying assault. Cannons and arquebuses roared from the buildings, cavalry charged into the dense, surprised crowd, and steel swords cut down warriors who had never seen such weapons. The massacre was swift and total. Thousands of Incas were slaughtered in a matter of hours, and Atahualpa was taken prisoner. The prophecy had been fulfilled with brutal precision. The bearded men had come, and they had shattered the empire in a single, shocking act of betrayal and violence. Atahualpa, hoping to secure his release, offered to fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver as a ransom. The Spanish accepted, and while the ransom was being collected from across the empire, Atahualpa continued to rule from his captivity, even ordering the execution of his brother Huascar to eliminate a rival. But once the incredible treasure was delivered, Pizarro reneged on the deal, putting Atahualpa on a sham trial and executing him by strangulation. The heart of the Inca Empire was gone. The role of the prophecy in this catastrophe cannot be overstated. It created a framework of understanding that initially paralyzed the Inca leadership. Were the Spanish the returning Viracocha, this ambiguity may have prevented Atahualpa from ordering their immediate annihilation when they were at their most vulnerable. It fostered a sense of fatalism, a belief that events were unfolding according to a divine or cosmic script that was beyond their control. When combined with the devastating impact of European diseases, which had already killed millions and crippled the empire's ability to resist, the prophecy became a self-fulfilling narrative of doom. The Inca story is a heartbreaking testament to the power of a prediction to not only forecast a future, but to actively shape it, disarming a civilization with the terrifying ambiguity of its own sacred stories, and leaving us to wonder if, without that prophecy, the outcome might have been drastically different. Now we turn from prophecies of empires and kings to a prediction that touches the heart of daily faith for nearly 2 billion people, centered on a single, ancient object housed within the most sacred site in Islam. Embedded in the eastern corner of the Kaaba, the cube-shaped building at the center of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, is the Black Stone, or Al-Hajar al-Aswad. It is not worshipped, but it is revered as a divine relic of immense antiquity, believed to have been placed there by the prophet Ibrahim, known in the Bible as Abraham, and his son Ismail. This stone, now encased in a silver frame and worn smooth by millions of touches and kisses over 14 centuries, is the focus of a remarkable prophecy that connects the acts of the faithful in this world to a moment of testimony in the next. The prophecy is found within the Hadith, the collected sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. One particular narration, recorded by scholars like Al-Tirmidhi, states that on the day of judgment, the black stone will be brought forth by God. It will have 2 eyes with which to see and a tongue with which to speak, and it will testify on behalf of everyone who touched it or kissed it with sincerity and true faith. Imagine the scene. In the ultimate courtroom of divine justice, this silent stone from Mecca becomes a living witness, affirming the devotion of those who perform the pilgrimage, the Hajj, or the minor pilgrimage, the Umrah. For a believer, this is a promise of incredible comfort and validation, a tangible link between a physical act of worship in this transient life and an eternal affirmation in the life to come. While the ultimate fulfillment of this prophecy is eschatological, belonging to the end of time, its significance is deeply felt in the present. Every year during the Hajj, we see a continuous, partial fulfillment of the stone's sacred role. Pilgrims from every corner of the globe, representing every race and nationality, crowd around the Kaaba in a ritual known as the Tawaf, circling the structure 7 times in a counterclockwise direction. A central goal of this circumambulation is to approach the black stone and, if possible, to touch or kiss it. The scene is one of profound collective yearning. For many, it is the culmination of a lifelong dream, a journey often saved for years. The act is not one of idolatry. Islamic theology is strictly monotheistic. Instead, touching the stone is an act of symbolic submission, a renewal of the covenant made with God, following the tradition of the prophet Muhammad, who himself kissed the stone. In this context, each touch, each kiss is a personal prayer and an act of faith that is, in a spiritual sense, being recorded by the stone, preparing for its future testimony. The stone's own history is as layered as its meaning. Islamic tradition holds that it originated in paradise, sent down to earth as a pure white stone to guide Adam and Eve after their descent. It turned black over the centuries, tradition says, due to the sins of humanity absorbing into it. It was lost during the great flood of Noah's time, only to be rediscovered by the prophet Ibrahim and his son Ismail as they were reconstructing the Kaaba on its original foundations. The stone's most dramatic historical moment came in the early 7th century, before Muhammad received his prophethood. The various tribes of Mecca were rebuilding the Kaaba after a flood, but a dispute arose over which clan would have the honor of placing the black stone back into its corner. The argument threatened to erupt into violence. They agreed to let the next person who entered the gate arbitrate. That person was Muhammad, then known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy. His solution was both simple and brilliant. He spread his cloak on the ground, placed the stone in the center, and had a representative from each tribe lift a corner of the cloak together, carrying the stone to its place. He then set it in the wall with his own hands, satisfying everyone and preventing bloodshed. This story underscores the stone's role as a unifier, a symbol of peace and resolution, long before its eschatological purpose was revealed. Symbolically, the black stone operates on multiple levels. It is a direct physical connection to the earliest prophets, a touchstone of faith that bridges the ages from Adam to Muhammad. Its black color, rather than being a sign of impurity, is often interpreted by mystics as a symbol of humility and the annihilation of the ego before the divine light. It represents the starting and ending point of the Tawaf, the spiritual journey around the house of God, making it a marker of both beginning and completion. The prophecy of its future testimony elevates it from a historical artifact to an active participant in the divine plan. It transforms the Kaaba from a static building into a place where every act of devotion is witnessed and remembered, creating an unbroken chain of faith that stretches from the past through the present and into the final reckoning. This prophecy, therefore, is not a distant and abstract prediction, but a living truth that imbues the pilgrimage with a profound sense of eternal consequence, reminding every pilgrim that their faith, expressed through a simple touch, will one day have a voice. But if the prophecies of the classical and Eastern worlds envisioned cycles of renewal, the Norse myths of the far north offered a far more stark and final vision of destiny. From the sun-scorched deserts and lush highlands, we now journey to a world of fjords and long winters, to the mythology of the Vikings and their chilling prophecy of the world's end, Ragnarök. This is not a quiet fading away, but a cataclysm of fire and ice, a final, glorious battle where the gods themselves are fated to die. The primary source for this epic prophecy is the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems preserved in 13th century Iceland, which capture beliefs that had echoed through the Scandinavian world for centuries. The prophecy of Ragnarök is a meticulously detailed sequence of doom. It begins not with a bang, but with a long, suffocating silence. The first sign is the Fimbulwinter, the Great Winter, 3 successive winters with no summer in between. The sun and moon grow dim, and the world is gripped by an endless cold. This cosmic winter is a prelude to a complete breakdown of social order. The bonds of kinship shatter, and humanity descends into a brutal war of all against all, a time known as the Axe Age, Sword Age, Wind Age, Wolf Age. Then, the restraints that hold back chaos are broken. Loki, the trickster god, and his monstrous children, the bound wolf Fenrir and the world serpent Jörmungandr, break free from their magical bonds. The dead from the underworld of Hell march forth on a ship made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead Naglfar, steered by Loki himself. And from the fire realm of Muspelheim, the fire giant Surtur advances, his flaming sword lighting up the heavens. The battlefield for this final confrontation is the field of Vigritha. Here, the gods and their Einherjar, the souls of fallen warriors taken to Valhalla, make their stand. The prophecies detail the fates of the major gods with heartbreaking specificity. Odin, the All-Father, rides to meet the wolf Fenrir, the child he once raised but always feared. In the struggle, Fenrir opens his massive jaws and swallows Odin whole. Thor, the protector of mankind and the slayer of giants, engages his ancient nemesis, the world serpent Jörmungandr. He defeats the serpent with his mighty hammer, Mjolnir, but staggers only 9 steps before succumbing to the serpent's venom. The one-handed god of justice, Tyr, fights the hound of hell, Garma, and they kill each other. The beloved god Freyr, having given away his magic sword for love, fights the fire giant Surtur with only an antler and is cut down. Heimdallr, the watchman of the gods, and Loki, the architect of the chaos, face each other and meet their mutual end. In the end, Surtur flings fire across the 9 worlds, the earth shudders, the stars fall from the sky, and the world, consumed by flames, sinks beneath the waves. So, how could such a vivid, mythological apocalypse be considered a prophecy that came true? The answer lies not in a literal reading of gods and monsters, but in 2 fascinating interpretations, one scientific and one cultural. Scholars have long pondered the origins of the Fimbulwinter, the 3-year winter that acts as the catalyst for Ragnarök. This could be more than just poetic imagination. The 6th century was a period of extreme climatic upheaval. In the years 536 and 540, a series of massive volcanic eruptions, possibly from Iceland or Alaska, ejected so much ash into the atmosphere that they blotted out the sun for months, even years, across the globe. Tree rings from this period show stunted growth, and historical records from as far away as China and Europe describe a year without a summer, followed by famine, plague, and social collapse. For the Scandinavian peoples, whose survival depended on the seasonal cycles, such an event would have been truly apocalyptic. The memory of this real-world catastrophe, passed down through generations in oral poetry, could have been woven into the myth of Ragnarök, a prophecy born from a collective trauma of a world gripped by endless cold. The second, and perhaps more profound, fulfillment of the Ragnarök prophecy was not climatic but cultural. The Viking Age, with its pagan beliefs and warrior ethos, eventually met its own end not in fire, but through the slow, steady spread of Christianity across Scandinavia between the 9th and 12th centuries. The arrival of this new faith, with its single, all-powerful god, did indeed mark the twilight of the gods for the Old Norse pantheon. The temples to Thor and Odin were abandoned or destroyed. The oral traditions of the Skalds were supplanted by the written word of the Bible, and the worldview that produced the prophecy of Ragnarök was itself consigned to the past. In this sense, Ragnarök did happen. The old gods died in the minds and hearts of the people, their world submerged by the rising tide of a new religious and cultural order. The prophecy, therefore, can be seen as a powerful, subconscious foreshadowing by the Norse poets themselves. They may have sensed the fragility of their own world, understanding that such a vibrant, violent, and heroic age was unsustainable. The story of Ragnarök, with its themes of inevitable doom and the cyclical nature of destruction and rebirth, provided a mythological framework for understanding the end of their era. It was a prophecy that came true not because a wolf swallowed the sun, but because the cross eventually replaced the hammer, and the world that gave birth to the Vikings sank beneath the waves of history. Moving from the mythological twilight of the Norse gods to the calculated battlefields of 19th century Europe, we find a prophecy that was not discovered in an ancient text, but deliberately manufactured as a weapon of war. Our 23rd prophecy takes us to the high-stakes drama of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, a conflict engineered by the master statesman of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, to complete the unification of Germany under Prussian dominance. Facing the formidable French army, led by the experienced and respected Patrice de MacMahon, Bismarck understood that victory required more than just military might. It demanded a psychological breakthrough. And he found his unlikely weapon in the troubled mind of a young king hundreds of miles away. The prophecy itself was simple, almost childlike in its formulation. It was said that an aging French marshal would be defeated by a boy king. This prediction began to circulate among French troops and even reached the ears of their commander, Marshal MacMahon himself. For a superstitious 19th century soldier, such an omen could be deeply unsettling. MacMahon was a veteran of Algeria and the Crimean War, a man whose entire identity was built on experience, tradition, and martial prowess. The idea that his fate could be sealed not by a worthy adversary, but by a mere child, struck at the very heart of his professional pride and hinted at a cosmic injustice. But who was this boy king? The answer lay in the Kingdom of Bavaria with its monarch, King Otto. Otto had ascended to the throne in 1886 at the age of 18, but he was already showing severe signs of mental illness, likely schizophrenia, which would eventually lead to his deposition and lifelong confinement. By 1870, though technically an adult, his childlike demeanor and reclusive nature made the label boy king a cruel but effective moniker. Bismarck's genius lay in his understanding of information warfare. Through a network of agents and sympathetic newspapers, his propagandists seeded this specific prophecy into the French ranks. The brilliance of the scheme was its multi-layered plausibility. First, King Otto, though largely a figurehead, was the nominal commander of the Bavarian Army Corps, which fought alongside the Prussians as part of the German coalition. Technically, a king was indeed on the opposing side. Second, his youth and perceived innocence created a stark, almost mythical contrast with the aging French marshal, fitting a classic archetype of the old order being overthrown by the new. The prophecy didn't need to be universally believed to be effective. It only needed to plant a seed of doubt to create a narrative of inevitable defeat that could erode morale at a critical moment. This was psychological operations, or psy-ops, generations before the term was officially coined. The prophecy's terrifying fulfillment arrived on the battlefield of Sedan in early September 1870. The French army under MacMahon had been outmaneuvered by the relentlessly efficient Prussian military machine led by Helmuth von Moltke. Cornered in the fortress town of Sedan, with Prussian artillery raining down from the surrounding hills, the French position was hopeless. During the bombardment, Marshal MacMahon was severely wounded by a shell fragment, forcing him to relinquish command. His replacement surrendered the entire French army, including Emperor Napoleon III himself, to the Prussians. In the most literal sense possible, the aging marshal had been defeated, and the army he led surrendered to a coalition that included the forces of the boy king, Otto of Bavaria. For any French soldier who had heard the prophecy, the events at Sedan would have felt like a chilling confirmation. The coincidence was just too perfect to ignore. This episode represents a fascinating evolution in the history of prophecy. It was not a mystical revelation from a distant past, but a conscious, modern tool of statecraft. Bismarck, a deeply pragmatic and non-superstitious man, had no belief in supernatural predictions. What he believed in was the power of narrative to shape human behavior. He recognized that in the fog of war, soldiers cling to stories that explain their reality, and a well-placed story could be as damaging as a cavalry charge. The prophecy of the boy king was a deliberate piece of propaganda designed to exploit the anxieties of the enemy, to make them feel as if they were fighting not just a superior army, but an unbeatable destiny. It was the ancient power of the oracle weaponized for the age of the telegraph and the popular press, demonstrating that the most potent prophecies are sometimes those we create for ourselves to unsettle our foes. Across the English Channel, in the tense and paranoid atmosphere of early 17th century London, a very different kind of premonition emerged, one that played out not on a battlefield but in the dreams of a pious scholar. The year was 1605, and England was a kingdom simmering with religious strife. King James I, who had united the English and Scottish crowns just 2 years prior, sought a middle path, but he could not escape the bitter legacy of the Protestant Reformation. For devout Catholics, the hope that James would ease the harsh penal laws that forbade their worship had been dashed. For radical Protestants, the king was not moving fast enough to purge the country of what they saw as Catholic remnants. This volatile mix of disappointment and suspicion created a powder keg, and it was in this climate that a small group of Catholic extremists devised a plan of breathtaking audacity to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of Parliament, obliterating the king, his family, and the entire Protestant political establishment in a single catastrophic blast. It is against this backdrop of conspiracy that we encounter the enigmatic figure of Bishop Lancelot Andrewes. He was not a mystic or a prophet by trade, but one of the most respected and learned churchmen of his day, a scholar of ancient languages and a powerful preacher in the court of King James. He was a man of reason and scripture, known for his piety and his measured approach to theology, which makes the story attached to him all the more compelling. According to an account that surfaced some years after the event, Bishop Andrewes was troubled by a vivid and terrifying dream. In this dream, he saw the specific date, the 5th of November, associated with a grave and imminent danger to the kingdom, a threat so severe it would shake the very foundations of the state. Disturbed by the clarity and urgency of this vision, he felt compelled to act. He reportedly sent a warning to a high-ranking member of the government, Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, who was the king's chief minister. The letter, as the story goes, was cryptic but direct enough to prompt action. It urged the authorities to conduct a search of the cellars beneath the Houses of Parliament. And on the night of the 4th of November, that is exactly what happened. A party of men, led by the Lord Chamberlain, descended into the labyrinthine vaults and found not just a stockpile of firewood, but a man who gave his name as John Johnson, standing guard over 36 barrels of gunpowder, enough to reduce the entire building to splinters. John Johnson was, of course, Guy Fawkes, a veteran soldier recruited for his expertise with explosives. The discovery thwarted the plot and led to the arrest, torture, and brutal execution of Fawkes and his co-conspirators. The 5th of November was immediately proclaimed a national day of thanksgiving, and Bishop Andrewes, it was whispered, had been the instrument of divine providence, his dream a miracle that saved the king and the Protestant state. But how reliable is this account of a prophetic dream? The historical evidence is intriguing but ultimately thin. The most detailed version of the story comes from a biography of Andrewes written decades after his death by the scholar John Buckeridge. While Buckeridge was a contemporary, his account is not a contemporary record from 1605 itself. There are no surviving letters from Andrewes to Cecil that mention a dream, and no official government documents from the time credit the bishop with the tip-off. The official story, promoted by the government itself, was that an anonymous letter had been sent to a Catholic peer, Lord Monteagle, warning him to stay away from Parliament. This letter, which spoke of a terrible blow but did not name a date, is a well-documented historical fact and is generally credited with triggering the search. So, where does the dream fit in? This leads us to the fascinating question of whether the story of Bishop Andrewes' dream is a genuine fragment of lost history or a classic example of a pious legend. In the years following the gunpowder plot's failure, the event was celebrated as a direct deliverance by God. The government and the Church of England had a powerful incentive to frame the discovery as a miraculous intervention, a sign that God favored the Protestant monarchy. Attributing the crucial warning to a dream experienced by a respected bishop like Lancelot Andrewes fit this narrative perfectly. It was far more spiritually satisfying than the messy reality of a possibly treasonous anonymous letter, the origins of which remain debated by historians to this day. The dream story elevated the event from a lucky intelligence break to a divine prophecy, strengthening the political and religious legitimacy of the regime. It transformed Andrews into a saintly figure whose personal holiness was so great that God communicated with him directly to save the nation. There is, however, another, more psychological possibility that bridges the gap between miracle and legend. Lancelot Andrews was a man deeply immersed in the spiritual and political anxieties of his time. He would have been acutely aware of the rumblings of Catholic discontent and the very real threat of assassination plots, which were a constant fear for European monarchs. His subconscious mind, working through a night of prayer and worry, could have synthesized these fears into a coherent and urgent warning. The date of the 5th of November, the scheduled opening of Parliament, was a matter of public knowledge. His dream may not have been a supernatural vision, but a profound and accurate intuition, a product of a brilliant, worried mind connecting the dots that conscious thought had not yet fully assembled. In this light, the prophecy remains remarkable, not as a message from God, but as a testament to the power of the human mind to perceive danger through the fog of uncertainty. The story of Bishop Andrews's dream, whether fact, faith, or folklore, endures because it captures a moment when history hinged on a secret, and the line between a warning from heaven and a warning from within became beautifully, powerfully blurred. And so we have seen prophecies born in sacred temples and whispered on ancient battlefields, but sometimes a prediction can emerge from the ashes of a conflict so bitter. Its shadow stretches across centuries and attaches itself to the highest office in a land not yet born when the curse was first uttered. Our final prophecy brings us to the early 19th century and the American frontier, to a confrontation between an expanding nation and the people whose land it was taking. This is the story of the curse of Tippecanoe, also known as the 20-year presidential curse, a pattern of death so strange and persistent that it has fueled speculation for over a century. It begins in 1811 in the Indiana Territory, where two formidable Shawnee leaders stood against the tide of American settlement. One was the famed warrior and strategist Tecumseh, who sought to unite a vast confederacy of Native American tribes to resist further encroachment. The other was his brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Shawnee Prophet. While Tecumseh traveled to recruit more tribes to their cause, he left his brother in charge of their main settlement, Prophetstown, located at the confluence of the Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers. It was here that the governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, a man ambitious for land and political glory, saw an opportunity. Leading a force of over 1,000 men, Harrison marched on Prophetstown, ostensibly for negotiations but clearly intending to provoke a fight. Tenskwatawa, perhaps feeling pressure to demonstrate his own power, allegedly told his warriors that the Great Spirit would protect them, rendering the white man's bullets harmless. He then launched a pre-dawn attack on Harrison's camp. The Battle of Tippecanoe was fierce and bloody, and while Harrison's forces ultimately held their ground and burned Prophetstown the next day, they suffered significant casualties. The conflict was a military draw but a strategic disaster for the Native American Confederacy, shattering the Prophet's spiritual authority. It is in the bitter aftermath of this defeat that the legend of the curse was born. As the story goes, Tenskwatawa, humiliated and enraged, called upon the Great Spirit to ensure that Harrison and every American president elected every 20 years after him would die in office. The pattern that followed is so precise it feels like something from a tragic play. William Henry Harrison, the man at the center of the initial conflict, was elected president in 1840, a year divisible by 20. His inauguration day was cold and windy, yet he delivered an address lasting nearly 2 hours without a coat or hat. He shortly thereafter developed pneumonia and died just 31 days into his term, becoming the first president to die in office. At the time, it was seen as a simple, if dramatic, tragedy. But 20 years later, the pattern repeated. Abraham Lincoln, elected in 1860, guided the nation through the Civil War only to be assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865, just weeks into his second term. The curse seemed to be gaining strength. The next cycle was just as ruthless. James A. Garfield, elected in 1880, was shot by a disgruntled office seeker in July 1881. He lingered for months, succumbing to infections from his wounds in September. William McKinley, elected in 1900, was shot by an anarchist in September 1901 and died 8 days later. The pattern was now undeniable to superstitious observers. The 20th century then saw the curse claim 3 more presidents. Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, died suddenly in 1923 during a cross-country trip. While the official cause was a heart attack or stroke, rumors of poisoning or suicide swirled, fueled by the scandals emerging within his administration. Franklin D. Roosevelt, elected in 1940 for an unprecedented 4th term, died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April 1945, just months before the end of the Second World War. And finally, John F. Kennedy, the vibrant young president elected in 1960, was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. This unbroken chain of 7 presidents, from Harrison to Kennedy, each elected in a year ending with a 0, each dying before their term was complete, presents a staggering statistical anomaly. So how do we explain it? Skeptics point forcefully to the power of coincidence. They argue that the curse is a classic example of apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. Presidents face inherent dangers. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, medical science was primitive, and security for public figures was often lax. The list of presidents who died in office also includes Zachary Taylor, elected 1848, and everyone after Kennedy, who were elected in non-zero years, breaking the supposed pattern. Furthermore, the historical evidence for Tenskwatawa actually uttering such a specific curse is thin, with most accounts appearing long after the fact. It is far more likely that the story of the curse was retrofitted to the pattern of deaths, a folk legend that grew in power with each new tragedy. Yet, to dismiss it entirely is to ignore its power as a potential self-fulfilling prophecy. The curse of Tippecanoe is not just a list of coincidences, it is a narrative that entered the American psyche. By the time the 1980 election approached, the curse was a well-known piece of political folklore. The candidate that year, Ronald Reagan, was fully aware of it. When an assassination attempt nearly took his life just 69 days into his presidency in 1981, the curse seemed to have struck again. But Reagan survived. Many have speculated that the very awareness of the curse led to a change in outcome. Perhaps it resulted in heightened security or a greater sense of caution. Or perhaps in surviving, Reagan, with his famous charm and communication skills, managed to symbolically break the curse's hold, demonstrating that even the most persistent patterns of fate can be overcome by human resilience and a bit of luck. The curse of Tippecanoe therefore stands as a powerful conclusion to our journey, a reminder that whether these patterns are woven by destiny, chance, or simply by the stories we tell to make sense of a chaotic world, they become a real force in history, shaping our fears, our actions, and our understanding of the past itself. From the smoky chamber of the Oracle at Delphi to the sun-drenched pyramids of the Aztecs, from the cryptic quatrains of Nostradamus to the chilling Norse vision of Ragnarök, our journey has taken us across millennia and continents. We have witnessed kings undone by their own assumptions, empires saved by sacred texts, and entire civilizations interpreting their downfall through the lens of ancient predictions. Each story is a unique tapestry woven with threads of faith, ambition, fear, and fate. Yet, running through this incredible diversity are powerful, common threads that bind these prophecies together across the ages. The first and most persistent of these threads is ambiguity. Time and again, we see that a prophecy's power is not in its clarity, but in its obscurity. The Pythias promise to Croesus that a great empire would fall was technically perfect, yet fatally open to interpretation. Nostradamus's verses are a masterclass in vagueness, allowing countless events to be retrofitted to his words. This ambiguity is not a flaw, it is the very engine of the prophecy's endurance. It demands an interpreter, a Themistocles to see a navy in a wooden wall, or a bishop to see a plot in a dream. It forces us to project our own fears, hopes, and biases onto the prediction, making its fulfillment a collaborative act between the divine and the human mind. This leads directly to the second thread, the monumental role of interpretation. A prophecy is inert, a sealed scroll, until a human mind unlocks its meaning. The early Christians who saw their 10 persecutions as a divine countdown were not passively awaiting doom. They were actively shaping their identity around a narrative of eventual triumph. The Yorkists who saw their champion in Merlin's Boar of Cornwall were using ancient poetry to legitimize a very modern political claim. And in perhaps the most striking example, the Inca and Aztec encounters with the Spanish were profoundly shaped by pre-existing prophecies about returning gods, which caused hesitation and fatal miscalculation. The prophecy itself is less important than what people choose to do with it. It can be a source of resilience, a weapon of propaganda, or a cause of paralysis, proving that the future is not just predicted, but actively created by our belief. And that brings us to the final, undeniable thread, the real and tangible impact these predictions have had on the course of human history. Prophecy is not a spectator sport. It has altered battles, toppled dynasties, and forged empires. The consultation of the Sibylline Books gave the Romans the morale to hold the capital, an event that arguably saved the Roman Republic in its infancy. The belief in the mandate of heaven, signaled by omens like the white snake, provided the philosophical justification for the overthrow of entire Chinese dynasties. Otto von Bismarck, that master of realpolitik, understood this power perfectly, weaponizing a simple prophecy to erode the morale of the French army. These are not just stories, they are case studies in how ideas about the future can change the present in the most concrete ways imaginable. So, after exploring these 25 astonishing cases, we are left facing the central, haunting question that has lingered over each tale. Are we looking at a gallery of incredible coincidences where random chance has arranged itself into patterns that our pattern-seeking brains cannot help but see? Is it evidence of something more, a divine foresight or a hidden connection to the fabric of time that allows certain individuals to glimpse what is to come? Or is the simplest explanation often the most likely, that these are tales masterfully shaped by hindsight, where historians and storytellers, knowing the ending, have woven events into a narrative of inevitability? There is no single, easy answer, and that is the enduring fascination. Perhaps the truth lies in a combination of all these factors. What is undeniable, however, is humanity's timeless, unwavering drive to peer beyond the horizon. From the most ancient shaman to the modern data scientist running predictive algorithms, we are compelled by a fundamental need to find order in chaos, to see a path through the darkness of the unknown. This quest for foresight is a testament to our courage, our anxiety, and our profound hope. It is a defining part of what makes us human. Now we turn the question over to you. Which of these prophecies did you find the most compelling, the most chilling, or the most difficult to explain? Was it the eerie accuracy of Ezekiel's prediction against Tyre, or the psychological power of Calpurnia's dream? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to continue this conversation with you. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the heart of historical mystery, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more explorations into the unexplained. Our journey ends where it began, with the human spirit gazing into the unknown, trying to read the signs. Whether these prophecies were divine messages, brilliant guesses, or stories we told ourselves, they have shaped our world in ways we are still trying to understand. They remind us that the future is not a fixed destination, but a vast, unfolding story, and our beliefs, our choices, and our interpretations are the ink with which it is written.